Thanks, Cobus, and thank you all. Yes, so maybe let me get this slide up. Cadastral means to do with mapping and the mapping out of land parcels, essentially, private land ownership, administrative areas, and so on. Classificatory, we'll get to that. So that's my title. So essentially what I'm going to be talking about is how rock engraving sites straddle, they fall across these land parcels, these boundaries that were created in the colony, both in terms of mapping and, of course, on the landscape in terms of fences. And there's a very dramatic fence there with fire breaks and so on across part of the Northern Cape landscape. And quite often those kinds of fences go up over hills, which is where rock engraving sites often exist. And one also encounters beacons and subdivisions of farms and so on. But my argument is that as physical places and all that is entailed in these rock art sites, which we begin to understand more as different perspectives are brought into the study of them, they're clearly centers of some kind on these places like hills, and I'll also have an example of a site in a river valley. So they were central places, but happen now to fall across these divisions in the landscape, and hence have been marginalized in terms of the colonial landscape logic, and this sometimes poses particular problems in terms of mapping sites, and more especially the management and legislation in terms of heritage. And I thought I'd just include some old maps of the area where we're in. There's been quite a lot written on the expansion of the colony up through the Karoo, Nigel Penn's book, but he doesn't specifically include this area. And this region is very interesting in that prior to the discovery of diamonds, the boundaries were all very fluid, and these map makers, you can see essentially the same kind of area. If you pick up on the squiggle in the river that in this map here is next to the word Campbell Grounds, you'll pick up that squiggle in the other maps as well. One gets a sense of how this landscape was changing. In that the top left map, there's the Griqua area that's indicated, and then the Free State. These are actually maps that I found together in a collection in Prague, they were just an amazing set of maps showing this fluidity that happened between the late 1860s and the early 1870s. In this map here, you can see Bultfontein, which is still, there's still a farm called Bultfontein, and there's Bultfontein mine, so that's actually Kimberley, and there's a little D indicating diamonds. And the map maker was confused in putting Boshoff between Kimberley and Berkeley West. Anyone who knows this area will realize that problem. Now, also interesting is to contrast the map top left and top right, where the Griqua are indicated as having a territory that extends down to Philippolis, essentially along I think it's the south of the Orange River, and to the north of the Orange River. And that was in fact an area that became known as the Albania settlement, where settlers from the Eastern Cape were brought in as a buffer between the Free State Boers and the Griqua. But this was just prior to the discovery of diamonds. After the discovery of diamonds, we suddenly see Campbell Grounds in the area around Kimberley, which in fact the Griqua never actually occupied. It was more a Corona area, if one was to, and the identities and the land occupation was all very fluid. So even saying it's a Corona area is problematic. But anyway, as part of the sort of British strategy, they wanted the Griqua to claim that, and so that was called Campbell Grounds, and that includes Kimberley. Then by 1871, and in fact yesterday I think was the anniversary of the Keat Award, which was a decision that allowed the British Empire to actually land grab Griqualand, what they call Griqualand West. And so that last map there shows Griqualand West with those solid boundaries established. And so I've said lines and labels are adjusted as people and places, and the balance of power were changed through that period. This is a contemporary Google Earth image, and you can see on this the imprint, as it were, or the reflection of differential grazing on stock farms, and this is the area just to the south of south of the Orange River, near Kimberley. But these kinds of landscapes are palimpsests. So there are many different layers of history. Some have been erased. Some sort of peek through erosion or whatever different kinds of processes that have happened, human and natural. And often these traces are only in terms of physical remains, such as stone artifacts, rock art, and of course in the archives we have the documents and even photographs. And nowadays even oral history gets reflected in something that's almost physical, digital technology and these photographs. So these are all aspects of these palimpsests, and one can go on to talk about place names. And within this area there are names that are of Khoisan origin, like Khane Hoek. Khane means camel thorn tree, and names that were given by the Griqua frontiersmen, like Magersfontein. Mager was a Griqua person. And then the Albania settlements, places like Belmont and Roscommon, reflecting the English influence coming in. And then we've had post-colonial naming in the area, like Mukala, which means camel thorn tree, and is in fact an imposition in the area in the sense that there was not Tshwana settlement there. So something including the word Khane might have been a better term if one's interested in reflecting the past, but maybe reflecting the present and the future. Mukala is entirely appropriate. But anyway, changing names reflect these changing histories and these palimpsests in the landscape that are physical and metaphysical. A typical hill in the Northern Cape, just outside Kimberley once again, and not very visible in the top picture, but there's a beacon. You can see it behind the individuals in the foreground here. There's a beacon right in the middle of a distribution of rock engravings, and that's a fairly common occurrence, and that's an indication of this sharing of space, as it were, between different periods, but then also reflecting this aspect of the cadastral carving up of the landscape. So my first case study is going to be within the Mokala National Park, south of Kimberley. There are several engraving sites within the park, and one of them is on a low rise which is cut through by this fence. And so this is a very dramatic instance of this contrast between pre-colonial and colonial space. And in the process, it's rendered what was undoubtedly some kind of central place into a marginal place at the edge of both the park and the property, and as a result, it's also excluded from rock art tours in the park. It's quite a distinctive site in terms of the park in that it's on andesite, whereas all the other sites are on dolerite. So it could have been a very interesting site to include in their rock art tours. And it can also obviously be the case where one looks at issues of colonialism and the carving up of the landscape and what it does to heritage. But anyway, it's excluded at the moment from their tours. And many of the engravings are very well preserved on the site, but those actually on the fence line have been displaced. This one with the ostrich, which has actually been used in some of the park literature. I'm not sure if it's still there, but it actually falls outside of the park, and it was actually moved. We can see that the rock was moved in order to plant one of the fence posts. And there are other indications. Those kind of yellowish rocks there are rocks that have been under the surface, and so they're not patinated and weathered like the others. So we can see where this disturbance of the rocks on that site has occurred. And there's another example. So that's an engraving that's outside of the park. Some Google Earth images are quite interesting to look at. The one in 2002 was before the park was established, and you can also see that I've included part of a 1 in 50,000 map that shows those heavy lines, which are the property divisions, the cadastral properties, and I've indicated the separate farm names on that top Google Earth image, and you can see that fence line coming south from the hill, which has probably got a fire break and has probably also got animals going to and fro. Animals make lines on the landscape, and so do little streams and so on. So it's interesting looking at all the different kinds of lines on the landscape, but the colonial ones tend to be straight and rectangular and quite imposing. Going to the 2019 image, by then the park has been established. That fence has been dropped, but you can see very faintly the line going up to that hill and then down to the left, and that's the line that goes through that engraving site. I mentioned that there are several other rock art sites in the park, and they are on dolerite, so they have a different kind of a character, and it's an extraordinary landscape with these koppies, these little hills, and many of them have engravings on them. I'm now moving to the case study of Driekops Eiland. So this is not far from Mokala Park, and the engravings are situated on glacial pavement in the bed of the Rit River. And that's an example of the imagery there. There are 3,500 individual images that have been documented, and over 90% of them are these geometric engravings. So there's been quite a lot of discussion as to whether these, in contrast to the engravings of animals, are made by some different ethnic group. That's very much a South African habit of seeing things in ethnic terms. And one of the distinctive features of the site is that when the waters rise in the wet season, not every year, but usually some of the engravings are submerged every year, but on some occasions it's dramatic where the river really comes down in flood. And I'm going to talk about how this riverine setting has a challenge for heritage management. In the first instance, this very active environmental situation makes it a difficult site to manage in terms of giving guidelines for visitors. Like at some other sites we make walkways and so on. That's totally impossible here. And then also this photograph at the bottom right, which I was with Stefan at the site recently, and this year it's been underwater for 7 months, which is the longest period I've ever been aware of it being underwater. This is a reflection of climate change, we think, maybe, and also the you'll notice there's a weir across the river and there are dams further up, and those are used to manage water flow in order to provide for agriculture further downstream. And so that has changed the flow dynamics very dramatically for this site. And all of those issues are difficult in terms of heritage management. But I'll also argue that this particular setting has significant legal implications in terms of the colonial parceling of land. And that is because rivers are often boundaries, often national boundaries, provincial boundaries. In this case, it's a boundary between two municipal districts, which also happen to be magistracies. So in terms of in legal terms, they're different, distinctly different parcels of land. It's also a boundary between two farms. Landsicht is actually a recent change. The older name for that farm begins with a K, and I need not say more. And then the farm to the south is called Bishibolt West. And so those are two distinct farms, and the boundary between those two farms is through the middle of the river and through the middle of the engravings. And in fact, most of the engravings are on one side. So as I say here, the pre-colonial place, which is spread over two distinct legal entities, itself defies legal definition. So when the site was declared in 1948 as a national monument, only one half of the site was declared. And it happens to be now the half that has fewer engravings. So most of the engravings at Precolonial are not a declared site. And there were two further survey attempts where the National Monuments Council, as it then was, sent out their team to the site to try and include the whole site in the declaration, and they could not do it because of this legal complication that you can't have a place that's in two spaces. Two legal spaces can't accommodate one other place. So it's a classic case of pre-colonial spatiality challenging the cadastral logic of the colony, and I will argue the post-colonial state as well, because we're still not able to declare the entire site. And then also in terms of different kinds of heritage management and tourism, it falls under Pixley Kaseme, which is based in Dar. It's right at the northern edge of that magisterial district. So there's absolutely no support from the site from local government in Pixley Kaseme. And as far as Francis Bart is concerned, the actual declared site is not within their jurisdiction either. I thought I'd actually also just slip in a slide there from outside of this particular area. It's from the dunes in the Kgalagadi. I was with some people from Witdry recently, Andriesvale, and in the background there's a parks official with his rifle across his shoulders, and in the foreground a community member. And this is essentially the kind of scenario that one also sees with Makala Park, where you've got the kind of emphasis on nature conservation, and many of the staff are almost paramilitary, and if you've got lions, you've got rifles and all of that sort of thing, and those are their concerns, and cultural heritage is often seen as being outside of their domain. That is changing. So there's now what they call a Peoples and Parks program, and so they're not so opposed to. We've also had situations in parks where they've actually demolished old farmhouses because of the attitude that people don't belong in these landscapes, whereas humans and animals have co-evolved in these very landscapes over thousands and millions of years. So yeah, I've made the point about these legal regimes of land management and nature conservation. But apart from these kind of physical and legal aspects, they also upset the conceptual boundaries and typologies that undergird the Enlightenment project, which of course finds expression in scientific as well as much conservation thinking that separates humans and animals, humans and environment. My heading there is Driekops Eiland and the Rain's Magic Power. That's a phrase that has come from an insider account relating to rain, which I have applied in some of my writing about the site of Driekops Eiland. And I've made the point that much of the writing about the site invokes ethnicity to explain the distinctive imagery, but that there are different kinds of histories that can be told, and that one has heard through different kinds of related contexts. So to move away from these kinds of cultural taxonomies that one has inherited from the older writings in archaeology and based in the Enlightenment ideas, so the rigid separation between human and nature, human and animal, mind, body, etc., those kinds of basic understandings of the way things are different for other groups. And even in Europe, there are ontologies that are different from the rational one of the Enlightenment. And so one can look at sites like these in terms of assemblages that include not only people but also animals and materials and rock and rain and rivers and circumstances in general. And so when you look at the rainfall and the rhythms of river flow, which is of course very much a scientific thing that's been established and charted, but in that you can see very clearly these patterns of seasonal ebb and flow in the river, which is also reflected, of course, in the flooding that I was referring to earlier. But along with these kinds of flows, one also has changes in vegetation, seasonal changes, plant food and medicine availabilities, and the comings and goings of animals. And if you live in that kind of context, and as we heard in relation to the film last evening, there's a very acute sense of the connections and the embeddedness of humans in the wider environment and all the different flows and processes that occur. And those are often taken up in stories and beliefs and rituals and so on. And so in terms of these different ways of knowing, I have argued for this site, and it's a hypothesis, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves as an idea and how communities might respond to it. But the idea that coming of age rites of young women that reference cosmological processes associated with rivers and rain, the moon, and the mythical water snake, which is spoken of in the Kham stories as Kwa, or the rain animal Kwakahoro. These kinds of elements in stories and in rituals might help us to understand this site of Driekops Eiland, which might have been a site where some of the coming of age rituals could have taken place. The stories talk about the rain animal, and that's actually a very violent storm that we had some years ago, but very clearly illustrates this male rain stomping across the landscape on rain's legs. The Kham stories talk about the he rain and the she rain being more gentle, soaking into the ground, bringing up the plant foods, whereas the male rain can be dangerous with lightning and flash floods, the water runs off very quickly, can actually destroy plant foods potentially, and so on. So these kinds of ideas about qua, which can travel in that form, but otherwise be in water holes that are crucial for people and in rivers. And I'm including here a remarkable piece of writing from 1959, a chap called Baron van Vreden, who was a school teacher here in Kimberley, and he was interested in these stories. And this is from an old Griqua person at Berkeley West. And it's very interesting in terms of the discussion yesterday about language. So he's actually, without a tape recorder, he's actually managed to capture a sense of that Charib Afrikaans, which also includes these pre-colonial ideas and these ideas of a different cosmological understanding, a different ontological way of being. And with this story, particularly about Kainas, the water snake, or die waterslang, Nochayametsi in Setswana, very similar ideas across the landscape. And he's telling about the place where Kainas lived in a pool in the river at Berkeley West. That's just one of the sources that gives insight into the ideas that might lie behind the marking of a place like Driekops-Eiland. And I think some of you might have seen these slides before. I showed them at the conference last year, but this was a reenactment by some old women in the Richtersveld of the Hokmesi ritual, and it includes the old woman on the left there, has markings on her face, and new beads, new clothing, etc., etc. And it was in the context of this ritual that one of the informants in the Blake and Lloyd records referred to his mother and his grandmother talking about the young maiden being called the rain's magic power. And so I think that Driekops-Eiland has a lot to do with this whole constellation of ideas relating to the rain's magic power. So this is once again something that's outside of the colonial way of looking at these sites in their cadastral places. My speculation is that this ritual might have something to do with the engravings at Driekops-Eiland, and I've wondered whether the markings made on the bodies of the young women who are coming of age might be reflected in the engravings, and indeed whether the engravings might even have been made by women. These are speculations that future research might tease out and possibly reject, but for now that's what I'm suggesting. And then one can also talk about these extended socialities where people are going through rituals in particular places, and they become embedded in different kinds of relationships with other people, with places, with things like water, kwa, the water snake, and so on. And so one has human, non-human, and inanimate persons in that way of understanding the world. Often the places and rocks and trees can be, in fact, persons, non-human persons. And so these all make up an extended sociality that extends beyond just humans. And in this way, the material world and all these relations can be considered to be co-producers of society. I'm going to end with this idea that what one has is a storied landscape. It's a phrase that comes out of a South American context, but it's very much reflected in the oral literature that's been recorded in Southern Africa in the Blake and Lloyd records. There are all this enormous richness of stories that people tell, of themselves and of animals and places and so on. And it expresses part of a complex way of being in the world. We have them in fragments that have been preserved, for instance, in the Blake and Lloyd records, in that piece by Barent van Vreden on the water snake at Berkeley West. They're told, they were doubtless sung and danced, and we also have these amazing things on hills which are rock gongs, and you can see they've been beaten in the past, and they're throughout southern Africa, lots in the Karoo. There's one near Driekops-Eiland, and these are an indication of some kind of maybe dancing, certainly music making, probably singing, and story making, so it's an image of a lively landscape, quite distinct from the notion that one often has encountered in the older writing on rock art, and in terms of all the sort of colonial logics that I've mentioned. And what is remarkable is that these stories are not completely silenced. The landscape is still full of the stories we heard yesterday, and just a recent example from the Karoo, where Jose de Prada Sampa has been collecting stories from farm workers and town dwellers in the Karoo that are quite close in many ways to the Blake and Lloyd stories, and he has published them in a similar way to the Blake and Lloyd, with the interleaved English and what is undoubtedly Charib Afrikaans. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
It's quite refreshing. I just wanted to understand, because it slipped my mind. Are they archaeological dates to some of these engravings? And could you, because of many layered history of ethnic groups within the area, could you maybe try to link it to a specific group or specific groups over time? So what would be interesting in my mind is the dates, because you archaeologists, you date very far away. So around what dates should we be thinking of these engravings? Thank you.
Okay, so that is one of our greatest challenges, those of us working in rock art. There is some success with dating with regard to paintings, where there are small quantities of organic material in the paints, and there are different techniques, other techniques that are used with films that have formed over paintings. With engravings, it's really probably our biggest challenge. So what we've tried to do in some areas, like in the Karoo, where there's generally not very dense occupation over very large periods of time, one tends to get sort of spikes of activity that's reflected in artifacts that are often in close spatial association with engravings. And so we've got speculation, hypotheses as to what links up with what in terms of dated other archaeological material. There has been an attempt to date Driekops-Eiland, for instance, in terms of geomorphological processes, but it's very coarse at this point. The feeling is that the oldest engravings there are perhaps about 2,500 years old, and the youngest probably about 1,000 years old, maybe younger than that. And so one's essentially looking at what we call the late Holocene. It's largely, possibly with both these sites, largely within the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. That happens to be, so getting any finer tuning of that dating is almost impossible at this point. But and then it also falls within a period of increasing social complexity in the landscape. Some people have maintained that Driekopseiland is a Korana site or a Khoikhoi tradition rock art site, and that the sites like the ones in the park with the animal images has tended to be regarded as central to what people refer to as San rock art. And I've maintained that there is insufficient evidence to be certain about Driekopseiland being distinctly different in context. And it's possible that one's looking at a different part of the landscape. So some sites are on hills, others are low down and in river valleys. And there could be ritual contexts within the same broader social context that result in different looking sites. I'm very open to someone finding good reason to say that Driekopseiland is a Khoikhoi site or a Korana site. But the archaeology around it doesn't include lots and lots of pottery. The stone-walled settlements that have been associated with the Riet River settlements are further upstream, and along with those sites there are no engravings like Driekopseiland. So these things don't fit into neat patterning at this point. And so the dating and the ethnic ascription is difficult to decipher. And what
can we also like link them to other tribes such as Botswana that were found in this province, or they only link to the Khoi people?
Okay, so archaeologically, we don't have evidence of Tshwana people directly in those areas like Makala Park or Driekopseiland. What we call the type R settlements, they're a particular distinctive kind of stone-walled settlements that occur along the Riet River further upstream, have been associated in terms of humans, have been associated with what are referred to as San or Bushmen, but people who were nevertheless in contact with Sotho-Tshwana to the north. There's quite a lot of Sotho-Tshwana material culture in those sites. And so there's interaction. That's one of the big things. I think there's a lot of interaction happening. We're in a frontier area, marginal in terms of farming. So it's environmentally marginal for farmers. But it's an area where people of different origins were interacting. We know that the Batlapin Khosis married Korana women, and there's a lot of evidence of interaction. Birchall in 1811 at Ditakung mentioned that most of the men are bilingual, meaning they were speakers of Setswana and Kora. But as I say, there's no direct evidence of Tshwana actually being in the area where these sites are. There are references in Birchall and other writers about Xhosa coming up in the early 19th century and being in that Riet River Valley. By 1835, the people who Birchall writes about in 1811 have disappeared. So what has happened in that intervening period is a Defakani, when there was large-scale, very violent disruption. And there are various debates as to what caused that. There were ripples coming up from the Cape through the Karoo, and societies were literally being smashed apart by violence and land grabbing, or people just moving in and grazing and claiming it as their own. And those were not all. So there were also people called Oorlams, who were people of mixed origin, some of them very largely Khoikhoi from the Cape, who'd been forced out of the Cape frontier area, and they were up in this region along the Orange River and causing a lot of disruption. So a very complex, fluid history, certainly from the late 18th century. And that's one of the reasons why it's also difficult to draw links between people in the present, specific people in the present, and these archaeological traces such as the ones we are looking at. Because it could be that there might not be descendants because there was genocide. The story of Kosop, which we tell at Wildebeestkerel, is an instance, a much later instance.
So today I will be presenting a bit of my research that is titled The Legacies of Copper Mining in Namaqualand through the perspective of people, the Mining Museum, and an autoethnography. My agenda for today's presentation will start with a short introduction of the context of my research project, a rationale, and then I will focus a little bit on legacies, and then I will move on to talk about the Mining Museum and archives, and then I will explain a bit on the methodologies of autoethnography, oral histories, and then finally the contested term necrography. So to start off with the introduction, copper mining in Namaqualand was the economic heartbeat of a once thriving community ever since the copper mining mania of the 1850s, according to John Smilberger. This economic centrality of copper mining declined as soon as the mine stopped their operations in the early 2000s due to the fluctuating price of copper and the remote and hostile setting of the Namaqualand region, as Kane Cross argues. This heartbeat pulsed a nationwide beat by being the reason why the first mine in South Africa is located in the Okiep district, and the first South African mining company was formed there in 1852 to mine copper from the copper deposits. This means that the Namaqualand copper mining mania sparked the flame of mining companies that ignited a fire throughout South Africa, as it also produced the first South African geological report, as well as the first geological maps which explains and portrays the copper fields of the Namaqualand region. Today, it is considered a censoring of history if you mention Namaqualand without referring to copper or the other way around, according to Steenkamp. Copper has made Namaqualand what it is, and undoubtedly Steenkamp's statement could be factual. However, I think there is so much more to Namaqualand than just copper, and with this research project, I will highlight the other important historical elements of Namaqualand, such as social resilience of its people. So the rationale of this research project. This study aims to investigate the economic and social impact of the rise of copper mining and its decline on the local communities in Namaqualand. The goal is to focus on people who were involved in the mining operations, especially the descendants of those who contributed to the success of the copper mining mania of the 1850s. It is important to get these narratives from the people who worked in the mines to counteract the hegemonic narratives that foregrounds the experiences of the mining companies and how they contributed to the mines in Namaqualand. It is through the stories of the people who contributed to the success of copper mining through their laboring lives that important legacies of copper mining in Namaqualand can be found. The memories of the past and how it influenced the people today are the kinds of narratives and stories that is important for this research project. and I will draw upon my own experience and situatedness as someone with knowledge of the mines, as a member of a family that worked. Oh, I'm sorry. I will draw upon my own experience and situatedness as someone with knowledge of the mines, as a member of a family that worked and still works in mining. Our family conversations always revolved around mining, as my family members tend to talk about their day at work. These mining conversations that my family often had also contributed to the inception of this research project. And as part of my honors dissertation titled A Synchronous Investigation to the Phonological Features of Contemporary Namaqualand Afrikaans. I'm sorry for mispronouncing that word. This thesis was written in Afrikaans and I had to translate it in English. So I conducted interviews with 13 residents of Nababib and the Namaqualand area to build a data corpus of recorded interviews to analyze them, or to transcribe and to analyze them to determine how contemporary Namaqualand Afrikaans sounds and how it looks on paper. And apart from listening to how they spoke Namaqualand Afrikaans, I was surprised to find that at least 5 out of the 13 research participants chose to speak about mining and its history. And this made me realize that Namaqualand has a story to tell with regards to mining. My own ongoing research in language has moved me to embrace memory and storytelling about mining and laboring lives of people. It is important to do this research now, as it is more than 20 years since the big Okip Copper Company discontinued their operations in Namaqualand. And most of the people who have worked for the Okip Copper Company is now very old, and some has already passed on. Thus, this research needs to be done as a way of recording, valuing, and preserving the experiences of the people who work for the Okip Copper Company and how it influences the way people live today in a Namaqualand society. Moving on to another section of the rationale that also helped me with the inception of this research project. So, I have 3 video documentaries that makes part of a conceptual framework, and they are about mining, and they have allowed me to conceptualize and develop more ideas for this research project. The first documentary is titled Mining Memory, The Legacy of 100 Men from St. Helena. This documentary revolves around 100 St. Helena men who left their motherland, the St. Helena Island, on 21 May 1907 to work in the copper mines of Namaqualand in the Northern Cape. This journey was led by the film's director, the anthropologist Professor Dan Yon, who was on a quest to find his own heritage in Namaqualand, where his grandfather, Richard Yon, has been one of the 100 men who came from the St. Helena Island. Yon's collection of recorded video discussions with the descendants of the 100 men from St. Helena can serve as a powerful source to understand how impactful the mining history of Namaqualand can be. The second documentary that I am focusing on as part of the conceptual framework for this research project is a documentary by the Surplus Peoples Project. It's titled Open Wounds, Closed Minds, Open Wounds, Nababib, the Untold Story. This documentary focuses on the way the closure of the mines in Nababib has affected the lives of the people who used to work in the mines, as well as their descendants, and it represents another potential archive of recorded interviews that people can use as an academic source or as an archival source when they are looking to conduct research about mining in Namaqualand. And strangely enough, I've used this documentary to draw upon my own research participants. So I watched the documentary and I recognized some of the people who were interviewed in the documentary, and I managed to track down a few of them and also have another interview with them. And some of them did not actually have the video or the documentary that was made by the Surplus Peoples Project. So again, they have that problem where they were just being exploited as sources for academic reasons. So I was at least lucky enough to provide them with this documentary, and that just gave me a sense of satisfaction because I could give back to people what they have been waiting for so long, and I have not even completed this thesis yet. So the third documentary is a recent documentary that was made by the Garage Dance Ensemble. It's titled Gat in die grond, wond in my siel, which translates to Hole in the Ground, Wound in My Soul. And it is an expressive documentary by the Garage Dance Ensemble, produced by Byron Claassen, and it portrays the lives of people in Namaqualand and how they go by their days of after the mines have closed. It represents an emotional legacy, but also serves as an example of the social resilience of the people that are still in Namaqualand. So in this documentary, there is not a lot of narration, but the few words that are spoken are really powerful, but the story is being told through dance. So the dancers from the Garage Dance Ensemble, they go to the specific landscapes where the slag from the mines, so the slag is the detritus of the copper that was mined previously, where that has been dumped in certain places in the communities. Then they would go there and they would perform dance ensembles to tell a story, and they would also sing. And there's the person who sings Suiker Bossie Ek Wil Jou Hê. He's one of the people who are featured in this documentary, and he sings a beautiful song that is played throughout this documentary. So I would really advise you guys to also watch that documentary. And then I think after yesterday's screening, after I watched The Broken String for the third time, at the beginning, they have this imagery of certain memorialization of the statues, but I also think there is a spatial legacy that is focused on when I look at The Broken String, such as the glory hole in Nababib that is focused in there, and the hole in Oakip, which is actually in the center of the town, and then the open mine with the water in Concordia. So I consider those specific places spatial legacies because it is something that has been left behind. But I will focus on legacies now. Through the incorporation of this term in the title of my research project, I feel the need to provide a brief understanding of this term and how I applied it to this research. I think that legacy could be considered interdisciplinary because it is a term that can be used in various disciplines to describe different situations, depending on how you use it. It is also a term that can be considered complex because of how it may have differentiated meanings in different contexts and situations. But the most important facet about legacy to keep in mind when we talk about this research project is that it is something that has been left behind by the past. And I have made my own categorization of the different types of legacies that I think is left behind. So I will start with the physical legacies. And those are just like the legacies that you can see, you can touch, like the legendary landscape of Nababib and Oakip. Nababib with the furnace and Oakip with the Cornish pump, standing tall, and it basically signifies the landscape. So the Cornish pump, as you can see here on the right-hand side, is the only one that is still left in the southern hemisphere, and it has been declared a heritage site. And then on that side, you will see the significant Nababib landscape with the furnace. And I think that is a physical landscape because it's one of the first things that you can see when you come into Nababib. And obviously you would want to know why it is there. And that is a story that needs to be told. And that story, I think, could be a legacy, in particular, a physical legacy. And then on the bottom, we have these machines that are at the Nababib Mining Museum. We have the steam-powered train, or what has been a steam-powered train called Clara, and then a bucketing that was used in mining to extract copper from the ground. So these are also, I think you can consider them physical legacies because there are still people who can tell you about the functions of each of these machines, and then they can tell a story about these machines, and that story can also make part of a legacy. Then we also have emotional legacy, and films such as Gat in die Grond, Wond in my Siel, I think is an emotional legacy because it explores such deep themes of how people are still surviving in post-mining society and how they are so resilient to at least, make a living of the land. So I could not find a visual representation of emotional legacy, but throughout that video, if you will be able to watch it sometime, I think you will resonate with emotional legacy. Then another legacy that I have categorized in my explanation on the use of the term legacy is a spiritual legacy. So the religious and spiritual legacies that has been left behind or that was created after the closure of the mines. For example, this new welcoming board of Nababib that was sponsored by the new mining development that started in 2021 called Cape Copper Oxide. This new welcoming board was unveiled on the 9th of August, which was Women's Day, and a few religious leaders from the community gathered together so they can have a walk from where it was supposed to be hanged, but they did not hang it that day, they just unveiled it. And then they had a walk, a prayer walk from where it was supposed to be hanged to the various churches in the community. So this welcoming board reads From Prayer Town to Glory Town. And I was fortunate enough to have one of these religious leaders as my research participant, and I interviewed him and asked him what is meant by this quote, From Prayer Town to Glory Town. And he answered me very confidently and said that after the closure of the mines, the Nababib councillors baptized Nababib as a prayer town. And I remember this, that they put on one of the councillors when she was the first female councillor that was appointed as the councillor of Nababib, and things were not really as good in Nababib, and she placed this welcoming board in Nababib to label the town as a prayer town, insisting that we need to pray for this town. So what this research participant said, that as we had to pray for positive change in Nababib, the new sign is now proof that our prayers have been answered because the new mining development makes Nababib's residents optimistic about a better future for employment. And that is how they now label the town From Prayer Town to Glory Town. And it's so ironic that the big hole we have in Nababib is called the Glory Hole. So now I will focus on mining museums and archives. I will be speaking a bit theoretical on the mining museums, and afterwards I will talk a bit about the mining museum that is in Nababib and the mining museum that is now opened at the Oakip Country Hotel. So utilizing the mining museum, I am analyzing and examining the knowledge that was produced through mining museums. I want to understand how mining past have been curated and exhibited to the public. I have been inspired by the project Mining the Mining Museum, in which the curator Fred Wilson sought to excavate the site of institutional racism and African American artifacts and heroes, to bring to light a cultural presence buried beneath layers of neglect and deliberate exclusion. I am mining the mining museum to extract narratives that may have been buried beneath layers of neglect and deliberate exclusion. Bernadette Lynch and Samuel Alberti categorize museums as having been complicit in the construction of a physical and cultural hierarchy that underpin racist thought throughout the museums. However, to make sense of this categorization and to understand what the museum means in Namaqualand, I am referring to Tony Bennett's book, The Birth of the Museum, in particular his chapter on the exhibitionary complex, and that is why I titled the slide, The Exhibitionary Complex, Mining the Mining Museum, because I drew my inspiration from the work of these two researchers. So, in the exhibitionary complex, Bennett draws on another researcher, Douglas Crimp's review of Foucault's institutional articulation of power and knowledge, such as the asylum, the clinic, and the prison, all of which have a sense of confinement and regulation. And according to Crimp's urging, the museum and the discipline of art history could also fruitfully take on Foucault's institutional articulations of power. But this suggestion was taken up by Tony Bennett, who argued that Crimp's proposal was misleadingly restrictive. And I agree with Bennett, because you will be restricting the museum, especially the mining museum, and especially if we think of new definitions of what a museum could be, if you would refer to the institutional articulations posed by Foucault, you would be restricting what a museum can be. So this brings me to the question that I am asking here, is whether the museum as an institution had control over power and knowledge. Bennett argues that the presence of a witness or an audience in the museums were essential to display the power of the people. So museum presentations in mining, through the notions of science, the environment, and economic triumph, might have overlooked the extent to which mining's achievements and afterlives relied on people's resilience. So, the Nababib Mining Museum has opened again this year. It was closed before COVID and then during the COVID period as well. And it opened the first time this year again when the flowers came out, because it's the tourist season. So that was the only opportunity I got to go to the museum again. I was fortunate enough that they hosted me so kindly, and they were really helpful when I visited the museum, and they provided me with a few documents that was digitized by the previous owners of the museums, even though I'm not so sure, because it just seems like a bunch of academic articles, but I go by what they say. They have digitized the information that was kept in the museum. So the problem I have with the Nababib Mining Museum is the fact that when it was COVID, it was closed, and in 2020, there was still no new mining development, such as the Cape Copper Oxide. And then another institution, the O'Keefe Country Hotel, which is a very beautiful hotel in O'Keefe, very original, it decided to open a museum space. And what they did is they took some of the exhibits from the Nababib Mining Museum that they deemed interesting, and they created a museum space at the O'Keefe Country Hotel. And they then titled that the Namaqualand Mining Museum. And then I visited that museum as well, and I was a bit disappointed to see that there has not gone a lot of work into curating the space to actually be informative of what this mining, what this museum should be, what it should represent about the mining history of Namaqualand. It was basically just a bunch of pictures against the wall. And then what I found interesting is I came across this newspaper that was in circulation during the mining times, and I will be using that as part of my archival research. I've managed to get my hands on a few of these newspapers, but unfortunately, as you see in those images there, those newspapers have been locked shut in that display because I inquired if I could use it for archival research with the care as an archivist would do, but unfortunately they cannot get the newspapers out because it has been shut. Display has been shut with bolts. They don't even have a key. So the only access I would get to those newspapers if we break the glass. So what I found when I went through the few newspapers called the Copper Gazette is that it was a mining community newspaper that predominantly focused on the news and the events related to the mining. And it was, as it was during those time, it was pre-1994, it was focused on a specific race group. However, they did sometimes make mention of other race groups when they especially excelled in sport, because one thing that the mines did, and which is so evident through the few newspapers that I read, was they held a lot of activities, a lot of sporting activities. They even had first-class training, and they would do it as a competition, and there were not really a lot of racial segregation with these competitions, and especially golf competitions, because the winners that I saw in the newspaper were not a dominant race group. So what I've also noticed when I read these newspapers trying to extract some information about the mining past of Namaqualand, I found that your race also determined which position you would work in the mine. So unfortunately, I made an argument that the mine unfortunately also used its power to create some kind of racial hierarchy, and which in the long run actually benefited only a certain race group, and not necessarily that it did not have any opportunities for other race groups, but some people some people who I've spoken to feel like they could have gotten more than they eventually got. So now I will focus on autoethnography. I think autoethnography is a relatively personal way to write when you are doing research, because you have to dig really deep within yourself to be able to write an autoethnography. But I think an autoethnography works really well with the type of research that I'm doing, because it allows me to create conversation with things such as these museum articles, these museum newspapers that I'm using as an archive. It allows me to write upon my journey to acquire these newspapers. It allows me to write upon my journey where I explored the different museums and how the museums have developed and the processes that they are going to embark on when they are going to exchange the exhibitions that was taken from the Nababit Museum to the Okip Country Hotel Museum during the pandemic. So I hope to write about that in the autoethnography. But with any further ado, according to Marisa Mendes, autoethnography emerged during the crisis of representation in the 1980s because autoethnography placed greater emphasis on how the ethnographer interacted with the culture being researched. Autoethnography, as Mendes argued, allows the researcher to draw on their own experiences to understand cultural phenomena. This approach enables me to display a consciousness of connecting the personal to the cultural, and I have acquired the personal knowledge about the mines, the museums, my hometown, Nababib, and the neighboring mining towns in general through my education on primary and high school. My situatedness in the area also allowed me to be updated on developments taking place in these towns. And now that I am more experienced and I have the opportunity to do my historical research, I can revisit these acquired knowledges with a more critical and analytical perspective. And an autoethnography approach will enable me to incorporate a bit of myself and my growth in this project, to juxtapose this with the prevailing hegemonic way of conducting research. In particular, my narrative writing can be categorized as evocative autoethnography based on Mendes's discussion that emphasizes the researcher's introspection on a particular topic to allow readers to make a connection with the researcher's feelings and the experiences. And I think it's really important that my feelings is also incorporated into this research project because it is a lot. To make sense of this, to make this autoethnography fruitful, I have been keeping a journal where I document my research expeditions and my experiences, which will assist me in writing in as much detail when I eventually put all of these journal writings together and use that to write my autoethnography. So as I mentioned, the autoethnography to me is beneficial because it will allow me not only to voice my experiences with the museums and the archives, but it also will allow me to get in conversation through writing with the oral history interviews that I will be doing. So it is a nice way to connect my research methodologies with one another. So another methodology, and I think is the most crucial one for this research project, is a critical approach to oral history methodologies. And I will use oral history methodologies to explore experiences of the past, in particular the mining past. I seek to learn about the past through the spoken words of the people of the present. It is an engagement with people in the present who have worked in and felt the impact of the closure of the mines, and that draws me towards oral histories. As past stories, according to oral historian Linda Shopes, can account for present-day experiences. Oral histories, life narratives, and interactive conversation will be integral to my understanding of resilience and the legacies of copper mining in Namaqualand. An oral history approach will teach me about both the past and the present from the perspective beyond and in conversation with my own ethnography. Since there are already hegemonic narratives surrounding the mining history in Namaqualand, oral histories can help democratize the historical record. Oral history can also widen and deepen the autoethnographical elements of the study, ensuring that there are a range of narratives and perspectives with which to weave a new understanding of some of the legacies of copper mining. Challenging the hegemonic historical narrations of the mines and the narrow approaches taken in exhibiting the copper mining history in the museums is key to my study. And the use of oral history for this research project can challenge the literature around Namaqualand and mining. As Shopes mentioned, that oral histories open up a new view of the past. Then I use a study by Thomas Dublin and Walter Licht, where they focus on the deindustrialization of the Antarctic region of northeast Pennsylvania, utilizing interviews to determine how men and women cope differently with the long economic decline the area has been facing. This example can be seen as closely related to the work that I am undertaking. While I assume that the economic decline in Namaqualand ever since the mines closed down has been the major experience of people from the area, and interviews produced by Dublin and Licht challenged me to ask open-ended questions about coping, resilience, and the wider legacies of mining beyond a narrow positive or negative impact approach. And then I have a detailed guide on how to interpret collections of oral histories, because oral histories is not just a golden road that you can get all the answers from, because there are a lot of factors to take into consideration, and there are a lot of literature that I still write upon using oral histories. But for now, I will go on to the oral histories that I have already conducted, and I feel really proud to show, because the participants, the research participants, is also really proud to take part in this research project. So I will just refer to 2 research participants who have been really involved in this research project, and they actually want to get more involved, but yeah, I told them I will show their stories at the colloquium. So the first person who I interviewed is Romario Cloete. Romario Cloete worked for the OCC for about 20 years. She started out at the OCC working as a cleaner, and eventually, as she continued working as a cleaner, she had an eye on bigger things, and those bigger things were literally bigger things because she had an eye on a belt truck. So she was the first female belt truck driver in Namaqualand, and she was so proud to share a story when I interviewed her, and then she said, "Dis wagtyd, laat iemand na my luister." So she talks a lot about her work as a cleaner and how she worked into cleaning the town center of Nababib, and how they used to keep it so clean and pristine that people could take their wedding pictures there. And she is so disappointed with the way things are today, because she feels like they should appoint a better team to take care of the city center, because when she was involved with cleaning of the city center, it was pristine. And still today, she say if you bring her a belt truck, she will be able to drive it. Even though her sight is not so good anymore, she said she will be able to drive that belt truck, because it was her everyday routine when she worked in the copper mines. She also shared some valuable tools on how to take care of copper, how to clean it properly, and how to make it shine, and how to make it last longer. And she also shared these 2 copper spoons that she received as a gift from the OCC, and we laughed about it and we spoke to it, and we came to the conclusion that this most probably can also be a physical legacy that you can put in your mouth. So the second research participant is one of the religious leaders that are heavily involved in community processes in Nababib especially. And his name is Joseph Reiter, but he goes by the nickname Joey Reiter. Before I forget, Auntie Florie's nickname was Flory Lorry, because she drives the lorry. So Uncle Joey is involved with the church. He is also, now that the museum has reopened, he is also one of the tour guides that take people on tours throughout the museum, explaining the vast historiography of copper mining that he has embedded in his head to the visiting tourists. So when I asked him if I can do an interview with him, he actually invited me to the museum again, so I can take pictures of him while he does these tours. because he mentioned to me after we have conducted our interview and everything, he's the one that who was featured in the Surplus People's Project, and he did not get his video. So I gave the video to him, and after he watched it, he says because he's getting so old now and there are not a lot of people who can talk about the mining histories of Namaqualand, he now wants to write an autoethnography because I explained to him what I'm using in my research. And I'm actually so glad that he proposed that, because that means that I can assist him also. So it's not just that I am using him for my own research. I can eventually assist him also to produce something that he can be proud of, to actually put what he knows onto paper and not just into someone else's research. So Uncle Joey, we had a really long interview because he spoke a lot on what happened after the mines closed. But what stood out to me is he said that and this plays to the argument of social resilience. He said when the mines were still in operation, they were not as spiritual. They almost saw the mine as their god. So they basically worshipped this mine. But when the mining operations closed, they now saw they have nothing. They did not know where to go. So, and that's how he got involved with the church. And they started prayer walks and prayer meetings, praying for a better future. And that is how they were involved in labeling Nababib as a prayer town at first, and then to the prayer town, now to the glory town. So Uncle Joey provided me with his own biography, where he grew up, where his parents grew up, and I included that in my own research because his father was actually one of the people who worked in the copper mines when it was basically the copper mining mania. So I was really lucky that I could at least get an interview with Uncle Joey and include this into my own research. So now I am going to this contested term that I think is contested, necrography. So necrography is a term that developed in context and debates and discussions on the social life of things and the biography of objects. Its key concerns of material culture studies, museum studies, and the humanities more broadly. Necrography is a term that I take from Dan Hicks's book, The British Museums, where he focuses on the Benin bronzes and colonial violence and cultural restitution. At first, I was a bit hesitant to use this term as a framework to my research, but I eventually grew accustomed to it, and I found a way to, at least to how I can use it in this work and argue with it or against it based on what I will be getting from the rest of the people who I still have to interview. These theories later made their way to museum studies and provoked thought around objects exhibited in the museums. The train of thought that prevailed was expressed in idioms around the life history of objects, artwork, and collections, and also their provenance. Dan Hicks drew upon these matters in a conversation piece for the British Art Studies series on necrography, Death Writing in the Colonial Museum. Hicks expanded on the idea of necrography as a critique of the proliferation of object biographies, the ubiquity in teaching art history, anthropology, and museum studies that had brought a new confidence to the old object-oriented museum histories. According to Hicks, the idea of object biography has overstated the stability and the coherence of things as they moved between contexts. And the term necrography was further developed from the idea of an entanglement that has served to hold back dialogue and action on cultural restitution in the present. Hicks argued that the most suitable text to support the idea of entanglement had been Alfred Gell's book, Art and Agency, an Anthropological Theory. Through this text, Gell rejected the anthropological study of art in symbolic or aesthetic terms. He rather adopted methodological Philistinism. To frame the study of art as one of social relations, not aesthetics, because the focus was rather on agency through objects as a kind of material prosthetic. So my understanding of necrography developed as I was reading Dan Hicks's chapter, is that it involved writing about the dead and the death that has been caused alongside the acquisition of objects through violence and to have assembled and exhibited in museums in Europe. These were not objects with social lives, but were objects that could be associated with death. Here I want to suggest that the idea of necrography can be extended as a framework to study locations that can be taken to be metaphorically dead or in the throes of a social death. The idea of necrography can be mobilized to speak to locations of historic sites thought of as kinds of objects where death has been caused, where people have been forced into a condition of surviving the threat of a location death or a social death. So with that I basically mean that if I refer to the town as becoming a location of death or social death based on its economic value, because there are not any other employment opportunities besides the copper mine, and we consider it to be a social death, we can use this term necrography to draw it up as a framework. But how did the death of the mines influence the people? Can we write about Namibia and its post-mining life through the idea of necrography? By doing research and determining how the death of a mine affected the people and how new mining developments actively caused the death of a town or the life of a town, I imagine I would be caught between a project of biography and one of a necrography of the town where I come from. The closure of the mine can be considered as having caused the death of the town from an economic perspective because of employment started to soar and poverty began to prevail. So applying the theory of necrography to my research, it makes me think of writing a eulogy for a town. And I have discussed this in last year's last year's colloquium also. But what was significant is as I was journaling for my autoethnography, last year was a really difficult year for myself because I faced a lot of death within close family members and friends due to the pandemic, due to old age. And I felt I've kind of lost my heritage, and I had to write eulogies for 2 people in those years, and I was just so stuck with this whole writing about the death and necrography, grappling with this term while I'm facing so much death in my life, that I just felt like maybe I should just write a eulogy for my hometown. So writing a eulogy is writing about death or how that death has influenced those around it, like the people who attend funerals. To make the point, eulogies and necrographies have similarities. What necrography, perhaps a broader and more theoretical application, does through doing this research and determining the impact of copper mining on the people of Namaqualand, I can decide how the legacies of copper mining should be reflected in a eulogy or biography. Is the category necrography applicable, or should we be thinking again of the biography of the towns, since recent mining developments have seemingly breathed new life into the economy of Namibia and Namaqualand? In the death drill of the necrographic might possibly have been halted through the will of the people to live. So then I ask this question again: how do you write a eulogy for a town that refused to die? For now, the answer is simple. You don't. You write a letter of gratitude because what doesn't kill you makes you stronger or stubborn like a Namaqualand donkey. Thank you.
Why do you make comparisons with the Pennsylvania, where South Africa has a long history of mining? It might not particularly be from copper, but a long history of gold. I didn't really reference one authority in South African mining. I'm interested why you draw. Hence I'm saying it might be a very fair question.
No, I think it's a fair question that should be posed to me, not from my supervisor. I just felt like that particular article, it fits nicely with how I argue my methodology section with oral histories, and I felt like the way those two researchers went about in conducting the oral histories and interviewing the research participants, it just made me comfortable to do my research also to follow their example. But I definitely do agree that I should include more case studies of where mining decline, where mining which has closed down has caused economic decline in South Africa, if I can find any studies. So if...
One last thing. Look for a book, Going for Gold by Tamba Muki. It looks at oral history and historiography. Going for Gold by Tamba Muki. And most contemporary work is by a chap called John Mashaya Mombe. He does a comparative study between mining in the Northern Cape and Mpumalanga. Once you just read those two sources, then I'll drop you so much.
Ja, die Noord-Kaap is 'n baie mooi plek vir Namaqualand. Ek het ook begin belief kry vir Namaqualand as 'n diploma. Maar nou die mining, so ek wil so graag die mining besoek. So my vraag is dan, jy het genoem daarvan toerisme. So hierdie toerisme wat kom, is dit elke jaar of is dit seisoen of is dit elke dag? So reden kom ek vra, ek het volgende jaar, ek het 3 lande van verskillende plekke in hulle provinsies wat vir my kom besoek in Suid-Afrika, waar ek pad is Namibia en Zambia. So dan wil ek graag gaan oornag saam met hulle in daardie geskiedkundige dorp soos Namibia.
So die beste tyd om te kom sal definitief wees wanneer die blomme uit is, want dan is die plek op sy mooiste en die mense is op hulle vrolikste. So die vraag in verband met toerisme, dit is maar 'n seisonale ding wat plaasvind in Namaqualand, want die mense kom, hulle kom maar vir die blomme. Dit sal baie weinig wees wat daar toeriste sal kom in die dorp, net om te kom leer van die geskiedenis van die dorp. En omdat toerisme so 'n groot impak het op die museum en dit ook bepaal het vir hoe lank die museum oop kan bly, is dit nogal 'n slegte ding, want die museum se oop bly word dan bepaal deur die hoeveelheid toeriste daar kom. Maar soos wat hulle mos nou gesê het, onder die nuwe mynmaatskappy Cape Copper Oxide, gaan die museum daarom nou die res van die jaar nog oop bly en nie net seisonale tyd nie. So ek dink Piet en Piet se toergroepe is enige tyd welkom.
Thank you, Romario. This is exciting actually. I'm fascinated by your intellectual evolution, which indicates certain competence in handling discipline from history to language. And at the end I was saying, this is a young anthropologist. So, where will you end with this? Because someone is so fast. I said, will it just be content by one sort of a research project? Or should you now be planning several research so that you really distill from this town that is refusing to die? You know, when you now talk of Negro, you know, this talk of the dead, you know, reminds me of the pharaohs. So something that is remaining in that town that is really fascinating that we cannot hold within this research. So it's not a question, but maybe a plea that you should already be planning several categorization of this research so that you really mine as much knowledge as we can, because this is really exciting. And when this colleague spoke about the other, the one was advising you on the references, I think these are made clear contribution to a certain historical perspective from archaeology, from linguistics, of the areas that we really need to know more so that we don't leave anything unturned, any stone unturned. So I'm really pleading that you recategorize this research and see what you can do for your master's, for your PhD, and then the follow-ups through academic articles. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Romario. I like the way you unsettle disciplines in the way you are approaching your research. Almost quite multidisciplinary museums, bit of historical methods, autoethnography, anthropological, and linguistics. It's something that I always encourage because I get anxious about disciplines that get stuck in their own. So I kind of like that about your take. I like the motif that you picked on, particularly on death and life, and how you are drawing from Danny's very provocative work around museums as places of death, but also he makes a counter proposal about life, and I think he calls this life writing. How do you write back life to that which has been killed as it went into a museum? He's talking about objects. And of course, he proposes repatriation and sending back, but he also proposes a methodological issue, which is biography and narratives from the ground, which is what I see from your methodological approach, that you've seen death of a town on account of an economic death, but you can resurrect, you can bring back life by telling stories, by people narrating their own stories of the experience. I really like that. I think you could also benefit from reading Achille Mbembe, particularly his take on what he calls necropolitics. And I know this is a very old reference, but Theodore Adorno talks quite vehemently about death and museums. And sort of the power of death, but also the possibility of life. So those are very important aspects. The other motif I personally liked was around halls. The first time I flew into this town, one of the most visible things you see is the so-called big hall. There's one, but there's a whole lot of them, and mine dumps. As a metaphor of what mining does to societies, they extract and scar not only the landscape, but the economics as well as the social and political and the lived experiences. But in the narrative, usually, so what you hear is the Diamond City. What you don't hear is that there were hundreds and hundreds of men from the Northwest who died while trying to mine the big diamonds. And what you're trying to do is to foreground those narratives associated with mining and development. So I think it's an interesting take. When you do make up your mind to come and register for a PhD, me and Dr. Rademeyer have to do a duel to see whether it's a PhD in history or in heritage studies. Thank you.
And the connection between death and glory hole, right? Because when we were there, we were told that glory hole was closed because people were committing suicide. So when I hear this conversation or this narrative about going from a prayer town, going from a prayer town to a glory town, there's this irony, because also remember Desmond Tutu said they came and they said we must pray. And then when we opened our eyes, they had all the resources, the land too, and we had nothing. And so when I think of mining and how it operates in the northern case, specifically in that town with glory hole, and the fact that people kill themselves in this glory hole, but yet the name glory hole is supposed to sort of illuminate this, this new breath of life into place, right? And so I was just thinking or suggesting that you don't forget to make the connection between glory hole and the fact that they actually closed it off because people had lost hope and started killing themselves. Yet we are now again a glory town because a new mine has come. But what happens when they close down that mine? Must we again now close it off because our people have lost hope and now are trying to kill themselves again? It's almost this unending circle where people just keep taking from the Northern Cape and leave our people destitute after that. But thank you for your work.
Thank you very much, Mario, for the insightful presentation, and thanks for the images. The flowering is visible. We know that we're in the Northern Cape now. Yeah, with regard to, the first thing I want to start with is the scope of the study. It appears that it is multidisciplinary in nature. So what I wanted to find out from you is, do you perhaps have a number of supervisors? From various disciplines. Just out of curiosity, because I know from where I am, normally if computers and linguistics is involved, we would get one from informatics and computers and then one linguistic supervisor. So that's one. And then the other is with regard to the name itself. At some stage you mentioned Namaqualand. So from the Nama language or the colloquium that we are using, Nababeb actually means, Nababeb, we don't say people, we say Nababeb. It actually means once you go over that hill, it's over, you're gone. That's what it means. So if we actually, I heard about death and all that. So one can actually read into that as well. To closely look at it linguistically. The word itself. Nababeb. It actually has got significance. Based on what I actually gather from the presentation. So thank you very much.
Dr. Connie Benson, who worked a lot with activism and archives and oral histories. And then my other supervisor, Prof Shiraz Rasu, who is very interdisciplinary as a scholar because he can be considered a historian, an anthropologist, to some extent a linguist, an archaeologist, a lawyer, then the list can just go on and on. And then I also have to give credit to Professor Dan Yon, who has also been a very insightful guide, almost acting as a supervisor, even though there's no binding contracts or everything, but just out of his own interest in Namaqualand also, and giving me that guidance from abroad is also. So I would say I have 3 supervisors. And then with regards to the definition of Nababeb or things, last year I actually started off my presentation with explaining what Nababeb means or Nababeb means, and it's so ironic as it includes or it basically draws upon the presentation that you did yesterday also, where even we have these different definitions of a word that is considered Nama, because now we have Nababeb, which means when you go over the mountain, as you just mentioned. And then Bradley Sitters last year made a comment where he says it means hump of a small animal. And then I was learned in school that it actually means plek waar die kamele water drink, and I assumed a camel also have a hump on its back, so it obviously has something to do with this hump or something that you go over or this boulder. But it's actually really nice to see that there are also variation in Nama, something to think about for that PhD in Nama. And then with regards to the question, so what people actually did is there is a copper rehabilitation plant called the Slag plant, which also employed some people, so they could have worked there. Because mining was predominantly the masculine workspace, like it would be mostly males who worked in the mines. So when the mines closed and the people got their money, as one of my research participants said, some men just disappeared with the money and went on to go and waste it somewhere else on greener pastures because he had that money now. And then the women in the area actually had to go out and find employment. So then they would go to like the main town, Springbok, and then they would go and look for employment there, or they would just work, like come to their own businesses and get involved with the church also. But then again, there are also other employment opportunities in Aggeneys, where we have the Black Mountain mining and the Gamsberg mining. So there is also opportunities for people from Namaqualand. The only thing is you need to travel really far. You need to wake up really early in the morning and then you come back very late at home. So that is the problem with working in Aggeneys and Gamsberg. It's a bit too far. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Cobus. This presentation is going to be a bit sort of multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary, whatever the politically correct term for that is. It will include archaeology, history, heritage studies, and perhaps even anthropology and military history at a point. It's based on some concentration camps, or as I like to use the term in the case of the black concentration camps. Can you hear me at the back? Without the microphone? Great. A bit soft, is that better? What's that? Okay. So this actually includes work of mine that started in 1999, and the initial project was in Brunfort for the centenary commemorations between the British government and the South African governments in 1999. And during that project in Brunfort, I located the site of the Brunfort forced labor camp, and I'm going to draw that distinction between concentration camps and forced labor camps in a moment. And also at that time identified an elderly woman who was about 110 years old, very difficult to estimate, who'd actually been in the Brunfort forced labor camp and yet had retained her memory. And after numerous interviews with her, I thought, well, there's certainly a story that needs to be told here. Because as we know, that is generally the widely perceived metaphor, symbol, image, historical imprint of concentration camps as they were understood, and in many cases are still understood. Rows and rows of white military tents, Boer civilians interned after their farms had been burnt, the landscape had been cleared, and the big fundamental difference there is that in the Boer concentration camps as they were known then, and are still known now, there was no forced labor applied to them. So they were rationed, they were accommodated, and they were provided with medical support, albeit not ideal, resulting in approximately 28 to perhaps 30,000 deaths during the conflict in these camps or while in transit to these camps. So that's the general sort of symbol of how they're understood. However, the black civilians who were also on the farms, also in the rural villages and so on, who were then cleared out at the same time that the Boer civilians were interned separately. And because
historians in the 1980s, 1990s, and even post-commemoration period, even up to now, because there were Boer concentration camps, the same terminology is then extended to black civilians who were interned. So there are Boer camps, black concentration camps. However, there's a fundamental difference between the so-called black concentration camps and the aptly named Boer concentration camps. Like the Boer civilians, black civilians were forcibly removed from their homes through the violence of war. They were then taken to military centres or urban centres, in this case Kimberley, so the districts of Boshoff, Jacobsdal, Hoopstad and elsewhere were cleared out of civilians and they were brought here. This was a policy and a program that was happening across the two former Boer republics, namely the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. However, the differential comes in where black civilians in these camps or internment centres were compelled through a work or starve policy by the British military to provide forcible labour to the mines, to the railways and to the British Army. And that is the fundamental difference there. So I've actually found the documents, conversations and minutes between the De Beers mine directors, Cecil John Rhodes, his henchmen, and in fact Lord Kitchener, who was in charge of the British Army at the time, where the actual literal term work or starve was used. So in other words, if the black civilians in these internment centres refused to work, they were left to starve to death. It was as simple as that. And they were also, again, interned against their will. There are recorded cases of them being shot while attempting to escape, which was unlike, let's say, the Boer camps where people trying to escape were pursued and brought back. Now, there are not many photographs that exist. I've spent 25 years trawling the archives around the world. There's some in a private collection, and there's some in the War Museum in Bloemfontein. When I say some, half a dozen perhaps. And then there's some that I've found elsewhere. So the photographs are very, very rare. They're very unique. However, the fact they do give us an insight into these forced labour camps and internment centres. In terms of the Boer concentration camps, there are thousands and thousands of photographs that do exist. So this particular photograph here, and I promise you this won't explode. Up here we see British mounted troops, and we see African women here being brought from Boshoff, which is about 60 k's away, to Kimberley. Now there were two camps in Kimberley, and I'll get to them in a moment. Again, this is an extremely rare photograph. It's a so-called medical inspection inside a camp. You'll notice the sort of shelters, corrugated iron, natural materials, sod clod, huts. And this child here with a ruptured umbilical hernia is actually being inspected. These children are having their stomachs inspected. He's looking down. Here she's revealing her stomach. And that's actually inspection for malnutrition, starvation, kwashiorkor, scurvy, and so forth. Over here on the far left, we actually have an armed black male who's actually working. He's wearing a British Army tunic, so he's actually working with the British Army, probably as a translator. And the medical doctor here has got a black armband on, so one can date that to the death of Queen Victoria in January 1901. Again, the same place. And from an archaeological perspective, these structures here, we've got traditional clay pottery pots on the roof to collect water, corrugated iron, and as we see here, there's really only women and children in the picture. There are no men. They've, by that point, been compelled through forced labour to work for the military in order to feed their families. So there was a project that started with a colleague of mine who's now deceased, Elizabeth Vught, who was the retired director of the McGregor Museum. And we took this on as a personal hobby. I don't know why, but nevertheless, it grew into a project. We were then funded by the National Lottery way back in 2002. And we used a transdisciplinary approach to actually locating the two Kimberley camps. And that involved, the sort of tangible process of the archival audit, which was done in South Africa and the UK, what was on the terrain in terms of tangible evidence, and then the intangible record, which was living heritage, which I'll get to in this presentation, and also oral history and memory. And we were very fortunate to uncover some of that. So our project looked at these camps here, Kimberley being the epicenter. where Orange River Station, which is 120 kilometers south of Kimberley, there was a black internment centre there, and they were moved to Kimberley, and then from Kimberley everyone was moved to Taung, and then from Taung to Dry Hearts, and Brussels Siding as well, and Freiburg had its own camp. We located all of these camps during our project. But now let's get to the Kimberley camps. There were in fact two. As I mentioned, there's one called Blankensberg Flag, which is roughly where the central treatment plant is in that area there. I've been onto that property since back in Kimberley. I came back to Kimberley from Australia in 2014, I think it was. And there's no trace of it left. The mining activity has destroyed it completely. And then the camp which we actually excavated was the first ever archaeological excavation in South Africa, is out here as the crow flies, approximately 7 kilometers away from the boundary of Kimberley. The interesting thing about Klippiespan is there's no archival record of it, nothing whatsoever. So again, when one goes to the War Museum in Bloemfontein, and their historians will say there were 65 black concentration camps, my research has it up to about 100. In fact, also the death toll, the official so-called death toll, if one can ever say official, is 20,000 black civilians. My research has it up to 30 to 50,000 black civilians based on archaeological evidence, which creates an entirely different historical narrative and heritage narrative, given the 27,000 recorded were civilians who died in the camps. So in the case of Klippiespan, in the high ground where your British sentries would have been, we found the positions. Down here, graveyards and all the various sort of key areas that we looked at. And these camps, again, the women and children were forced labourers to actually farm. So there's the evidence of actual agricultural land and the impacts on the ground of human activity. Now the next photograph, this one here, is the only photograph, there's two, there's only photograph that is actually taken in one of the two Kimberley camps. And it was, I can say that because it was an album that I found in a very obscure place, where in fact it was a member of the Kimberley Light Horse, which was a Kimberley-based regiment. And we know from the records that they operated out towards the Boshoff area, so it ties in with that. And it's almost like an anthropological study. He was photographing what he sort of saw in front of him. But again, very interesting from the perspective of the building materials. We still see this today in South Africa, grain bags and so on. And useful from the archaeological perspective because, for example, here at Klippiespan, you can actually see the impact of ground. This was taken in about 2006, so it's over a century old, where human impact has actually impacted the ground in such a way that grass doesn't grow there anymore, or grows sparsely, shall I say. So again, this is the second photograph in the camp. We can look at the building materials here, corrugated iron, that sort of thing. And when we go onto the terrain, you find that nature does not grow in right angles. It's not possible. Grass does not grow like that. So that is in fact the corner of a dwelling or a shelter. And in fact, in that particular case, we excavated that exact spot, and that's what we found. So there's the corners of a sort of shelter made from corrugated iron and grain cloth, lower grinding stones, upper grinding stones, fireplace, bone, tin ration tins, and so on the ground. There's just some photographs of the personal effects. So down here, gold-plated or gold-leafed teardrop earring. Again here, another teardrop earring, evidence to a woman. And then the sort of general sort of shot of the works in progress that were happening on the ground. Also here again, this is actually a silver bra buckle made in Paris, silver thimble, condensed milk tins, and again jewelry. So it's all evidence to when we found about 2,500 to 3,000 artifacts on that particular site over the course of a year. And we certainly didn't excavate the entire site. We took samples where it was very obviously that there's been people living there based on the grindstones and also the nature itself. So for example, here there's a barrel hoop that's been used as a fireplace, typical braai where the fire's in the ground in a recess with a hoop. That's in fact where a tent pole went into the ground, so obviously a medical area. We found evidence of medical bottles there. Grinding stones with broken bone and that sort of thing, smashing the bone marrow out. iron hoe, and then various other sort of food preparation items there. Again, the sort of combination, there's a lot of animal bone, rabbits, aardvark, anteaters, birds even, where in fact, so there's evidence of trapping, evidence of hunger as well, top of a bully beef ration tin, so sort of mixed rationing, the official bully beef ration from the British military, and then of course hunting and foraging as well. Regimental button, British Army, York and Lancaster regiments, in London, went through their records, and lo and behold, they were involved in actually securing civilians during the war. So the tangible evidence linking to this camp that had no written archive, but could be interpreted from its archaeological record. Again, sort of bridles for mules, mule shoes, and in here sort of again bits and pieces of ammunition and so on, which is the evidence of the British military on the terrain, linking it to there. Because in the back of my mind, I always thought to myself, it's the kind of thing where you write this thing up and somebody sticks up their hand and says, well, actually there was a migrant labour camp there for the Kimberley Big Hole, and your hypothesis falls to pieces. So the British military link is extremely important. Again, this photograph here, you can see a sort of bucket with a handle, the identical object found on the veldt. Upper and lower grinding stones, and the issue, there we see them all there, upper and lower grinding stones, grain being issued, and then obviously being used to grind it up. And the one hypothesis we had is that we found hundreds of these stones, and they literally marked where all the tents, or not tents, but shelters and dwellings were. And the theory we came to is that they had wheeled transport when they were brought in from Warsaw, because some of these stones were literally like this, very, very difficult to carry. They had wheeled transport when they were brought in, the wheeled transport was confiscated, and when they were then moved to dry hearts, they were left behind, they couldn't carry them. In one particular case, the burial site at Klippiespan, there was a half a broken grinding stone on the grave, marking that it would be a woman's grave, and about 300 meters away in a living area, we found the other half, and it matched exactly. So the stone was broken, the one half was left in a living area, and the other half was put on a grave, which was quite an eerie experience, to say the least. So to form Dry Hearts concentration or forced labour camp, as I mentioned, there's the stats, the people from Kimberley, the two camps in Kimberley, Orange River Station and Taung. And then this photograph coming up now is the only known photograph. It's dated September 1901, when exactly the move of civilians was started. And this is Kimberley Railway Station. That window is still there. That roof is still there. It's exactly the same spot. And what we see in this railway carriage, again, is grain bags and so on. So they're being transported with what they had at Klippiespan, or Blankenberg Vlei, 2 dry hearts. And there's no men in the photograph here. There's a youth shirt, but it actually looks like at least more than one family that are in there. So as I mentioned, they were taken to Taung first, where they were kept for about 6 weeks. There were already refugees being interned at Taung. Now, the burial site here contains at least 2,000 graves, probably 3,000. The British military records have 85 black civilians dying in the Taung camp. They lied, under-recorded. So therefore, when you talk about official stats being 20,000, you go into the terrain, you start extrapolating this, you get to 30 to 50,000 across South Africa. That's just the site on the ground today, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of cairns of rocks that mark the spot, overgrown. This photograph was taken in 2001. It's a much younger version of myself and a much older version of John Bartman, who was born on the farm in 1926 and lived on the farm all his life. The farm is called Vygebooms It's near Dry Hearts Railway Station. And his father was in fact in that camp, and he was able to point out the burial site and able to tell us first-hand accounts of what actually happened in there. So just from some high ground, the modern-day village of Ntwana-Hatsi and Morateli, there's 2 villages there. Morateli here and Ntwana-Hatsi in the background. They actually literally overlaid the exact living area of where the camp was. So myself and Elizabeth, we would actually stay there. The Kahosi actually gave us a place to stay. We'd spend weeks out there, walking between all these buildings to find any visual trace, ration tin or some bits and pieces. There was absolutely nothing, which again confirmed the fact that the camps had to be kept clean. The British military would actually lash people if they dropped their rubbish around, so it confirmed that. We did find the old wells and so on. The railway station where they disembarked from Tjiohimba is still there. The buildings are there. I was there a few months ago. Nothing's changed much at all. There's just more people living there. That was one of the original structures related to the original farm at the time, which was there, and the original kraals, which were used by the British military. Another one of the original houses here, which was also used. The archival records confirm that they did, because they paid rent after the war for it. This was Captain Lockwaters. He was in charge of the camp, and ironically enough, after my PhD went online, his descendants contacted me because they found my name linked to it, living in Canada, and wanting to know if I had any information about their relative. And I was like, well, how do I tell you that in fact he ran a concentration camp or a forced labor camp in which thousands of people died under his care? Anyway, I did. I never heard from them again, which is unsurprising. And of course, in his records, he talks about, he actually brags, we actually did a really good job. We sunk wells, or we found them there, we found the original wells. Got the ground under cultivation. Doesn't say, of course, it's been cultivated by slave laborers or wartime forced laborers. Now, interestingly enough, before the camp was formed, 3rd of September, Reverend Brown, who was the Reverend at Kuruman Mission Station, the Moffat Mission Station at that time, he actually goes to the camp. Now, the camp was only opened in November 1901, after the move to Tjiohimba and so on. So he's gone out there. There's already civilians there who've been dumped by the military in the area. And I mean, that is the only written account that I have found that actually gives someone an insight into what was going on apart from Lockwaters' self-aggrandizement and bragging. And it speaks to itself. Lockwaters, in his report, when compensation is being paid out after the war, he refers to an acre of land taking up the cemetery. Now, that's a large amount of ground, okay? And that is the cemetery today. So this particular odd square here, I believe, is the people who were there that Reverend Brown encountered. And they all died out. A lot of them died. And then the next part of the cemetery here, this section here is 1901, because there are marked gravestones, and I'll show them in a moment. And this section here is 1902. So these people died out, and there's probably at least 600 to 1,000 graves there, and in here there's at least 2,000, perhaps even more. We did search around here, all over, spoke to all the locals, they were quite adamant when they moved there. The only graves are in that area. It's not that they went and built on top of others. So again, in the cemetery itself, each flag marks a burial mound. It gives you some idea. It's a tiny little section there, and that's the sort of overall view. And John Bartman and even other elderly men in their 80s and women in their 80s in the village were quite clear about it. When I asked them, what was the cause of death, the same narrative came through. It didn't matter who one spoke to. Is that the internees died from poison pup. Poison pup was the narrative. It came through again and again and again. Now we know for a fact that from the Boer perspective, there was also talk about fish hooks being put in rations and so on. We know that to be a load of nonsense. And it would be untrue that the British, who actually need these forced-time labourers, would be poisoning them. So one has to look deeper than that. And what we found, or what I found, in the other camps that I've located about 16 other camps across South Africa. What I found there, the records are consistent, is that they were not provided with coal, and if there was firewood on the farm where the camps were, or farms, the farmer was paid out compensation for the use of firewood after the war. So ergo, there was no coal here, and there was no firewood. And there's no mention with the farmer in his compensation claims, which were quite extravagant in some cases, ever referring to firewood. He referred to water being taken from his wells, but he never referred to firewood, meaning there was none. So therefore, what do you boil your pot with? And if you've got all sorts of contaminated water with typhoid fever, enteric fever, which was the case across camps, be they war concentration camps or the Black Force labor camps. If you've got typhoid fever in your water and you can't boil it, you are going to catch typhoid fever, or enteric fever, or gastroenteritis, or whatever. And therefore, you're going to ingest it, and you're going to die. And the locals there were quite clear. They said entire families are dropping dead, according to the oral history they heard, which ties in with that. Now, in terms of the gravestones, there's probably about 40. And it's quite unusual because you go to other campsites, there are graves there are headstones, footstones and so on. You might be lucky to find one or two engraved, if at all. So, I mean, there's Sarah Beletsa, who was born in 1890, who died in 1901. And interestingly enough, on her grave, and I'll get to it in a moment, was a Stone Age tool, a hand axe. There's Sani Dami, who was an adult, born 1881, died on November the 9th, 1901. And there's very different engraving styles there, which again speaks to people coming from different areas of Boshoff, Jacobsdal, Hoopstad, Lukhof, and various other rural areas as well. So there's Ototoro, there's again Dorcas, with dates on and so forth. But you can see the different styles. And one of the things we didn't do was excavate into graves. But we worked out where the sort of the pathways were. So you'd have headstone, footstone, and then the next sort of row. And we excavated some of the pathways where there were broken stones. So, for example, here the grave is actually in that direction. The pathway is here, and by excavating this protruding broken stone, was able to find the rest of the shards and actually reconstruct them and get the identities of people off. So, I mean, there's another example there with all the engravings. We ended up reconstructing that stone in its entirety. And what was interesting was some of the patterning that was in here, and I'll get to that in a moment. I've spoken to some of our linguists here at the university. What does Sala 3 mean? And if anyone's got the answer in the room, I'd be really excited to know. But what was interesting with the children's graves, there's probably about 4 or 5 where you could tell they were children's graves by the size. You'd find these Stone Age tools on the site. We've spoken about that before, David. And so Elizabeth, who had an interest in stone tools, we walked ourselves to pieces, and me panting behind, looking for stone tools in the veld, miles away from where the Mtswana and Mulratele were. We found nothing. There was absolutely no evidence of Stone Age tools anywhere in the area. Nothing. Not even a shard of it. However, at Klippiespan, there was no end of stone tools on the veld. Plenty of them. And, a good variety of them as well. So the hypothesis was that, in fact, children who'd been brought from Klippiespan, Kimberley, had brought these stone tools with them either as toys or as talismans, and when they died, they became grave goods on the grave. And that's the point as well, is that the cemetery itself, there are no grave goods. There's absolutely nothing, except in a few cases, these stone tools on children's graves. And, the oral history was interesting because Klein Jan Maraping, who was 88 years old, and I asked him, I said, why on earth are you called Klein Jan Maraping? Why Klein? You're one of the oldest people in the village. And his father had actually served in the war with the Schweizeranica Commando as an Anmiray. He'd seen action in Margesfontein. He was captured at Paardeberg. And he said, well, my father fought in the war, so he was Groot Jan Maraping. I didn't fight in the war, so I'm Klein Jan Maraping. I thought, how modest at the age you were. Anyway, so we spoke to a lot of the elders, and they're the same thing. Their fathers were all Achterreyers, had all served in the Kimberley area with the Boer forces. And it was the same narrative through and through. The British took them off the land and treated them like slaves, which then itself refers back to forced labor, and of course, mass starvation. And the evidence that I found of ration issues was millipap. That was it. Nothing else. No meat, no milk, no vegetables, millipap. That's a starvation diet. Eventually you die of hunger. It's simple as that. And what was interesting is, for example, Dry Hearts now could actually start to work out where these people came from. Because in Boshoff, the original cemetery, and that their settlement was burnt down, destroyed during the war, and after the war it was built a short distance away. So in the original cemetery you find that sort of shaped grave with a cross there, which is identical to that shaped grave at Dry Hearts with a cross there. You find the cut of an angle like that, and then down, and then like that. Now maybe I'm reading too much into it, but same story there. And the same surname, Dame, okay? That's also at Boshoff. So one could say that these people were from Boshoff, or those particular graves, interring them. Same story again in Boshoff. So these sort of angulated engravings on the tombstones at Dry Hearts, which one sees there, down there. Same surname, Moremi, same engravings at Boshoff as well. So one could say that those particular cases came from Boshoff. Now one could go on and on and on. Are there any questions at this point?
Thank you so much. No, thank you. I was completely stunned. I couldn't help but just think about, you mentioned that you had also spoken to the elders. I mean, you've given an example of Kleinian. And I was just thinking about memory and how kind of the practice of memory work and how the purpose that memory serves specifically for those people that you were interviewing. And I just wanted to find out, so the way that they were kind of narrating their oral history and what they can recall based on their memories, based on the evidence, were there any contradictions? And how did you resolve that if you found any contradictions? In terms of the physical evidence of what you were finding versus the kind of the oral narratives that they were sharing with you based on their own recollections.
In Brunfort, the elderly lady, her name was Eliza Ngane. As I said, the estimates were she was 110. Okay. And I asked her in 1999, who was the farmer? What was the farmer's name that this camp was on that you were in? And she said Johnny May. And I thought, well, that's a contradiction. I mean, it's a Free State, for heaven's sakes. It's Brunfort of all places. Johnny May is terribly English. Now, a search of the deeds office revealed that the farm was owned by Lucas M.O.R.E with a hyphen. Not M.O.R.E, M.O.R.E, okay? And Lucas M.O.R.E served with the Brunfort Commando. When the British Army arrived in Brunfort, stuck his hands up, signed an oath of neutrality, and rented out his land to the British. In Brunfort Cemetery, he's buried right at the back, like he's ostracized, okay? And in the South African War, after the South African War, Boers who actually cooperated or worked with the British forces were known as joiners. So in the mind of a 110-year-old woman, Joiner M.O.R.E was Johnny May. Okay? So there's no contradiction there. You've got to look a bit deeper. In the case of Dry Hearts, there was no contradiction between what they were saying about the cause of death. Where they were consistent, with the exception of John Bartman, is that after the war the farm continued, and Bartman's parents stayed on, he was born there, his siblings were born there. And it was with the sort of creation of the Botswana and the build-up to that, and forced removals relating to that the villages of Morotel and then Twana Hatsi happened. So in other words, they arrived and found the gravesite there. They found John Bartman there, and in fact John Bartman's father was still alive at the time. So they heard that oral history from the Bartman family as to who were these people. They couldn't tell us who they were, but they could say they were quite clear on it. Boys and pup, and the British treated us like slaves. So there was no contradictions. But they were consistently clear about it. But coming back to Brunfort, that for me was the most remarkable one. Johnny May, Johnny M.O.R.E.
Fascinating, because so I'm not too sure if you are aware of it, but there was this major study kind of looking at apartheid memories, so the memories that people have of apartheid and forced removals, etc., etc. And what they found was that there were actually a lot of contradictions in how people remember certain things versus kind of the evidence, the official records. And we obviously know official records are not always official, as you have illustrated as well. But what I'm just thinking about, what would then be the implications of your work then? Because I'm just thinking about, because memory and, I think there's this kind of memory turn that's happened in South Africa over the last 10 years, at least if you look at the kind of social science research that's been happening. And so I've just been thinking about, clearly based on your work, there's no major contradiction. And so I'm just thinking about what would the implications be for how we apply memory work then, because what we see with the apartheid archival work and research are those contradictions, and yet you are finding that in your case there's no contradictions. I'm just thinking about what are the implications then of your work then for the rest of, or the other people that's doing this work on archival versus kind of memory work.
I think the thing there is that there were contradictions where the British archive, in terms of death numbers, were contradictory to what the evidence showed on the ground, most definitely. In some cases, they weren't even recording fatalities, which they were supposed to do. I always say to people that the thing is, I don't like to rely on the written archive purely because of that contradiction in this kind of field. One has to actually go onto the terrain. So, for example, with the arms struggle, if we take the Battle of Quitaconaval or the Battle of Lomba River, you go back to that terrain and you start counting tanks, you start counting shot-out vehicles and so on. Your evidence is there versus what people wrote about it afterwards. So you will get those contradictions, but the thing is, if one's doing forced removals or researching forced removals, for example, and you're relying only on the written archive, well, you know who wrote that archive. You actually have to get down to the terrain. I did a project for Johannesburg Metro in 2004, where they were commemorating, or going to commemorate the Sophia Town 50th forced removal. And my brief was to go to Sophia Town and identify whatever heritage residue was left, okay, whatever that might be. So started with an aerial photograph taken of Sophia Town, where it's crystal clear. You can see people in their yards, okay, before the forced removal. And there was this one narrative that somebody was so distressed with the whole thing that they hung themselves from that tree over there. Problem was that tree's not in the aerial photograph. So, obviously someone hung themselves somewhere, but it wasn't that tree. And, there was whole sort of areas of driveways where you could see it in the curbing stones were misaligned to houses that were built. So, that tangible was there. So were trees that were there and so on. So not just buildings. So you can actually go to the sites. I mean, if you look at District 6, for example, I mean, the rubble's been lying there since it happened. We've got the Malay camp just across the road, and my colleague Dr. Pinto, who's not here at the moment, we're actually looking at wanting to put a trench in there next year to see what we find, because I've got an aerial photograph of the Malay camp. So you can use the archive, sure, but you've got to use the terrain too if it's possible. Otherwise, I mean, archaeological evidence speaks to itself. It's like a forensic crime scene. There's your evidence. Now your archive says this, your evidence says that. Where does it go?
I've got one more question. Well, not one more question. At what point do we move from, I think it's a general question, at what point do we move from, okay, this is a contradiction, or this is misleading, or this is, people are lying. What is the threshold? I think it's a epistemic question I'm asking. How do you move that this is a contradiction because of X, Y, and Z, this were being misled, and this the people were lying, and where does your work fit? Because you use the word contradiction about 30 times. It's a contradiction. So what if they were misleading or they were just plain lying?
Well, people lie all the time. It's part of being human. So you've got to assume that in your narrative. The question is, okay, how do you move from it? Well, if you're doing any form of historical research or other kinds of research, you've got to build that factor in. Otherwise, what's the point? You've got to say, fine, I need to identify these contradictions if I can, because then what kind of narrative am I going to produce if I don't? I hope that answers your question.
Mine is not a question, but just a comment with regards to your presentation, because I thought maybe from part of military critical studies,
what I begin to see in terms of analyzing the landscape, in particular how the military does violence, not just the human beings that we see, but the landscape itself. But not only that, in the context where the military does violence to the landscape, but also interestingly within the same context, you realize that there is also domestication of the landscape itself from the reading of what you're thinking.
Yeah, that is correct. The other way as well, there was a very good paper I read in the 90s about the Battle of St. Luana. And something that always struck me then is the author wrote it from the perspective of how that landscape was developed geologically, so over the millennia. So this landscape develops and it prepares itself for the military to then come in and do what they're going to do. And they choose that spot to do what they're going to do because the landscape is ideal for it. And that's very much the case here, is that there were criteria. So the British wanted, firstly, farms that there were no Boer civilians on, all black civilians. It had to have water. It had to be at least a mile from the railway line. There were various criteria. So that landscape, in a sense, determined what was actually going to happen there.
What I want to discuss with you this afternoon has a very long title, but it's narrowed down to what you will realize afterwards, something very specific. It's a project that we've been working on for the last 6 or 7 years, and it's unfortunately, I wanted to make it competition time as well, but unfortunately some of my colleagues know the answer to this one already, so I'll get to that later on. But it's looking at the time period 1880 to 1920. It's in the heydays of Cecil John Rhodes, and it's in the heydays of the diamond rush and things like that. And if you'll excuse my French, and I'm not going to say too much about it, but it's what I like about this story. It's almost like from the resistance side, a type of a pick a finger situation towards the British, right? And you'll see now, and it's fascinating, and the more we've dug into this research, the more we realize that the people in question has always been a step ahead of the colonial rulers in the area. Right, so as I said, unfortunately, some of my colleagues already know the answer to this one. But if I give you this list of, 2, 4, 6, 8, 7, 8, 9 facts about a person, and given where we are working at, the first African person to pass the Cape Civil Services exam was a Supreme Court interpreter, an author, editor of a Tswana-speaking newspaper, spoke 6 languages, political activist, Secretary General, or as it was known at that stage, the General Secretary of the South African Native National Congress. Very instrumental in the development of the Malay camp, and this person owned a house and lived in a house in Angel Street. You sure?
I don't know, I said.
Right, the immediate thought of that is it should be Sol Plaatje, but just for one, Sol Plaatje spoke, I think, 8 languages. So the person in question is this gentleman, Isaiah Battenbele. Now, he was the brother-in-law to Sol Plaatje. And the more we dig into this person and the role he played in the resistance movement in Kimberley, you will see how there were a couple of very prominent people in fighting colonialism at the time. And there's actually three people that are instrumental in many of this. On the left-hand side is Isaiah Battenbele, in the middle Sol Plaatje, and on the right-hand side Richard Nsimang. Now, both Sol Plaatje and Nsimang was married to relatives of Isaiah Battenbele. And digging a bit deeper into the idea of Isaiah Battenbele before we get to the resistance and sport in Kimberley, many historians have already said that Battenbele would have been a very remarkable man in any era, in any country. Right? There's so many things that he was involved in, but he was born in the Eastern Cape in 1870, so he originated more or less at the same time as Kimberley, so that's one of the resemblances. And he was, for a couple of years, he was a Supreme Court interpreter in Grahamstown, but then he moved to Kimberley in 1894, basically at the same time that Sol Plaatje moved back to Kimberley. And there's just 4 things that I flagged just to show the close partnership that there was between Isaiah Batumbele and Sol Plaatje. First of all, and this I saw in a couple of original documents, is that Sol Plaatje was actually the very first friend that Batumbele made when he moved into Kimberley. Batumbele was also very instrumental in getting Sol Plaatje his job in the court in Mafeking, as it was called at that stage, just before the South African War. As I mentioned, Sol Plaatje married the sister of Isaiah Batumbele. And interestingly about this, there was within the 2 families, there was a lot of unhappiness about the marriage initially. Because Sol Plaatje was Setswana speaking, and Batumbele and his sister, they were Mfengu from the Eastern Cape. So that's one of the first places where Batumbele had to step in for his brother-in-law and say to the families, listen, this isn't, strangely enough, the way they explain it, they were talking about this is the modern era. I mean, we're talking 120 odd years ago. And then also, the last comment that I want to make about this is that Batumbele actually arranged Sol Plaatje's funeral in 1932. So you can see there's a very close link between the 2 of them, but sadly, in most instances, and Garth was talking about a hobby, this was a hobby, looking into Isaiah Batumbele, and for the first year or 2 years in looking into his history, you type his name onto the internet, 2 paragraphs, they say, by Isaiah Batumbele, this, and this. Paragraph number 3, but his brother-in-law, Sol Plaatje, and then they carry on for 10 pages. We have been battling to get his complete private collection. At this stage, after speaking to many people, there's about 60% of it that we do have now that we can work on. But also looking at, and as part of our broader project, looking at the sports history during the time of the struggle in the Northern Cape, we're getting more and more information on him. But there's still a couple of areas that we battle to get hold of. So interestingly enough about Batumbele, and when I wrote this down, I thought I wanted to make it clear to you that I'm not explaining this to you or telling you this to show you that Batumbele was part of the black elite or anything. But he was, according to Professor Andre Odendaal, and he also said reputedly, he was, when he started in Kimberley, he was seen as the highest paid African government employee. Right? He got a very meager salary of £25 a month, but all that money, and this is why I'm mentioning this to you, all the money that he got went back into the community, into a school, into the church, into sport. So that's basically who the man was outside of the resistance against sport in the Northern Cape. He was also very heavily involved in education. This is a picture of the board of trustees or the council at the Lyndhurst Road School, which is about, 200 meters from here. Back right is Batumbele, and third from the right is Sol Plaatje himself. Now coming back to sport in Kimberley and sport in the Northern Cape, and this is a quote that I've had for about 20 years, and I never really understood it well until I started working on the sports history of the Northern Cape, where Archer and Boylan in their South African Games, Sport and Racism said, Since the discovery of diamonds, sport became a mechanism to help develop and stabilize societies in Kimberley. For many, sport was far more than just a social event. It became a framework for survival, sanity, and prosperity. And as I said, I've had this quote forever, and I only realized when starting to work on this how true that was about the non-white groupings in Kimberley and in the Northern Cape. It's like, in many instances, you will see people saying, we didn't do sport because it was fun, or because we needed to try and get into shape, or it was exercise, or so on. For most people, it was a survival mode, or it was for keeping their sanity. But as you will see later on, the influence of especially Batumbele started playing a very interesting role in how they were countering the colonial powers, not only in the Cape Colony as a whole, but especially in the diamond fields and in Kimberley and surroundings. Then two other quotes before I start looking at sport in the Northern Cape. The first one is from Professor Richard Lapchick. Now, in the year 2000, he was regarded as one of the 20 most influential people in sport in America. Right? And he said that Kimberley is regarded as the historical home of black sport in South Africa, based mainly on the work and the achievements of Isaiah Batumbele. Obviously, Batumbele was not working alone, but you will see as we continue, he was instrumental in many things. And I do apologize, there's a lot of dates in here. So for the non-historians, I'm sorry about that. You don't have to remember it. I just want to show you a sequence of how in a matter of 10 years, a lot of things happened in Kimberley. And then unfortunately, it all unhappened again afterwards. And then Professor Brian Willen, who's an extraordinary professor also in humanities at Sol Plaatje University, said that at the time of the discovery of diamonds, Kimberley in particular became a cultural melting pot and a growth point in sport. Right, so now with this background, we can go back to the whole idea of resistance against colonialism through sport, or the other notion of non-racial sport in Kimberley. Right, so the 1890s can be regarded as a golden decade in black sport in Kimberley. Because you must remember when diamonds were discovered in this area and all the colonial powers ran to the area to enrich themselves, it was the same time that all the colonial sports came to Kimberley as well. And at the same stage, while it was moving into this area, it was also starting to be played by the other different groupings in the area, not only the colonials. So by 1890, there were already 2 cricket clubs, and you will see in many instances I have capitalized words like colored or African or black, because that is how it came from the sources that we looked at. I did have a very long debate, and my PhD was basically sport as factor in the struggle in South Africa. And there I was told to not capitalize it at all, but there is, in all the documentation, it was written like this, in many instances by Batumbele himself, so that's why I kept it like that. So there was, by 1890 already, 2 cricket clubs, African cricket clubs, and each of them had several teams. And it's so interesting, in some of the documentation we did receive, there was discussions where people asked, so how do you play cricket? And the other person said, I have no idea, but this ball seems like it can hurt, so we're using it. So it was almost also a way of getting rid of frustration. But these teams grew stronger and stronger, and there was a lot of social occasions. And interestingly enough, I will get back to that social occasions, because I also had the impression initially that there was a lot of segregation when it came to sport during that time. But our friend Batumbele did a couple of very clever things where he dragged people like Cecil John Rhodes and the mayor of Kimberley right into a social event without them really realizing what they were doing. Right, so right from the outset, from early 1890s, they were talking about non-racial sport in Kimberley. And if I talk about they, it's the people from the area, or the people that moved in here that were not part of the British colony. Well, let's put it bluntly, the non-white people. They were happy to play one another. So basically, they spoke about local teams that included the colored people, the Indian people. Strangely enough, they spoke about the Malay people. It was, according to them, in brackets, all the time they said Malay, in brackets, Muslim. So that's how they distinguished between different areas, but once they started playing sport, it was one group. So in 1892, the Griqualand West Coloured Cricket Union was formed, and then 2 years later, the Griqualand West Colonial Rugby Union was formed. Now, strangely enough, you will see the difference in the naming. The one says the Coloured Cricket Union, the other one says the Colonial Rugby Union. Now, this was the influence of Buttonbele. The Colonial Rugby Football Union was also the first non-racial sporting organization in South Africa. And Buttonbele was adamant. He said, I'm not going to call it colored or African or black. I want to call it colonial. And that's where the first time that the pick the finger idea comes in. Buttonbele said, I'll show them. We can speak about colonial and including people, unlike the white people or the British that spoke about colonial and excluded people. Right, so as I've already mentioned, the word colonial was specifically used there to show that there was no idea of racial segregation in this grouping and that they were serious about sport. There is another very interesting connotation to this, which happened a couple of years later, or actually 2 instances, which I will get to just now. And my apologies for my isiXhosa, because it's almost non-existent. So I used the English words where Buttonbele said in his own words, our colonial rugby football union will not discriminate on color, nationality, language, and religion. So his friends from the Eastern Cape, when he spoke to them 3 years after that, when the South African Coloured Rugby Union was formed, said to them, what do those 4 things mean? So he said, well, handwritten, he said, in isiXhosa, these are the 4 words. That there is, and it would be a nice discussion, there is 1 or 2 of the words that I'm not sure about the spelling of it. I'm not sure in isiXhosa, do you ever use 2 H's next to one another? Does anybody know? Not that I can think of. Because that was one of the things and one of the reasons why I took it out, because I thought it might have been a spelling mistake. But then on the other hand, it's handwritten, and it was written by Buttonbele, who could speak 6 languages, and that was fluent in isiXhosa, so I wasn't sure about that. Right, in 1895, there were already 3 tennis clubs in black tennis in Kimberley, and the way we were talking about language yesterday and today, and the descriptive meanings of the different languages, I just thought these 3 names were brilliant. Blue Flag, Champion, and Come Again. So I take it Come Again kept on losing. It's one of those ideas that I've got. Right, so from the local rugby union followed the South African Coloured Rugby Football Board. That was established in Kimberley, and the Savona Cafe, which is in George Street, I think George Street 45. I've gone there, there's a new building up there. The current owners knows nothing about this, so unfortunately, that is part of history that's gone. So at the same time, in the late 1880s, Sir Donald Currie donated 2 cups for cricket and rugby for white sport, for white rugby, for white cricket, which he called the Currie, both were called the Currie Cup. So Isaiah Buttonbele said, but why do the white people have to play for cups and we play for nothing? So he first went to speak to Cecil John Rhodes, And he said, yo, you are doing it, and it's literally noted like that. You are doing a great job. And Rhodes thought, okay, I'm impressed. And Badembele said to him, can you donate a cup for black rugby in the province? And Rhodes agreed. And Badembele said, there's one condition. This cup, we're going to call it after you, but it has to be more expensive than the white curry cup. Right? And it literally, I tried to convert it. It cost, in 1897, it cost £50, which is about 144,000 Rand today. So it was quite expensive, but they got the Rhodes Cup, and then shortly after, the cricket players started asking Badembele, how on earth did you organize this? Can we get one for cricket as well? So Badembele, again, he went to Sir David Harris, who was involved in De Beers, and he said, we already have a Rhodes Cup, can we have a Bonato Cup as well? So he got 2 cups for them, one for black cricket, one for black rugby in Kimberley. It originated here, but the rugby, the non-racial rugby tournaments and cricket tournaments that started the next year, that was played between 4 different provinces: Western Province, Eastern Province, Transvaal, and Griqualand West. And again, it was linked to black or African, as they put it, the Coloureds, the Indians, and then the Malay people, in bracket, the Muslims. So with the first Rhodes Cup tournament that took place in 1898, Isaiah Badembele thought he wants to have quite a good number of spectators around. So he went to the mayor's office, and the mayor, being British, Isaiah Badembele spoke to his secretary and he said, can I please speak to the mayor? And she literally said to him, no, sorry, the mayor is white, you are black, you cannot speak to him. So what Badembele did is he went to the local newspaper, the Diamondfield Advertisers. He put an advertisement in the newspaper inviting the mayor to the first tournament. Now, the first tournament was played as what we know today as Beaconsfield, very close to Greenpoint. And it's literally, Badembele put this advert in the newspapers. 2 days later, he gets a message. The mayor's secretary wants to see you. So he goes back and he says to her, yes. She says, the mayor wants to know what time is the first game. So he went down there. It was, and we're trying to verify some of the pictures. We're not sure how authentic they are. But there was quite a large crowd there. And afterwards, unfortunately, those of you coming from UWC will like it. I wasn't that impressed with it, but the first 3 tournaments in this Rhodes Cup was won by Western Province. So I'm sure you will. But it was thanks, Jacob. It was literally, some of the players of Western Province said they were astonished by the fact that a white person is giving them the medals. And Badembele said, that's normal to us. I mean, look at the nice cup we got from them. So it's yet another point where there was almost pick a finger, decide what you want to do or not to do. Unfortunately, at this stage, black sport in Kimberley was gaining a lot of momentum. But unfortunately, what happened then was the South African War took place, the First World War took place. And although the Rhodes Cup continued from 1903 to 1909, it never reached the same heights as it did during that last 10 years before the turn of the century. So I've just put in there 2 pictures for you, the Rhodes Cup on the left and the Barney Bonato Memorial Cup to the right. So politics stepped in. And if I talk politics, I'm not only talking about party politics. The Union of South Africa in 1910, the Natives Land Act of 1913, the aftermath of the South African War, the fact that they stopped mining for diamonds, the fact that most of the colonial powers moved to the Witwatersrand, and things like that played an important role in almost, I wouldn't say the collapse of black sport in Kimberley, but the fact that it started going down. Interestingly enough, still during this period, and you will see the disconnect where we go from a South African colonial rugby football union now starting to look at a South African Bantu rugby board. So even within the communities, there was polarization that took place because of influences, outside influences, political influences, and so on, and the colonial influence itself. But interestingly enough, the first secretary of the South African Bantu Rugby Board that was established in 1945, his name was Haile Plaatje, and his father was Sol Plaatje. So that you can see it's almost like a family business in many instances. And then in 1938, after the Rhodes tournament that took place in Kimberley again, there was a coloured Springbok team that was selected that went on tour the next year. And of that, I knew very little until a friend of mine in the Cape, Hendrik Snyder, told me about Pinky Julius that was on that tour and so on. And so there's another branch that's opened up in this whole research on the history of resistance against first colonialism and then against apartheid through sport. So coming back to Isaiah Batumbele, at long last, more than a century after what he did, he was inaugurated into the South African Sports Hall of Fame as the father of black sport in South Africa. Unfortunately, during the First World War in 1915, as part of this after effect of political interferences, the formation of the Union, the Natives Land Act, and all these other things, he lost his job in Kimberley. He moved down up to Pretoria. He became the second General Secretary of the SANNC. And although he was involved in sport still, he was never again actively involved as he was in Kimberley. So many people are saying the decline in what happened to black sport in Kimberley and the Northern Cape was partially because Isaiah Batumbele left Kimberley. There was many other reasons that also led to that. And unfortunately, after that, black sport and as part of the resistance against colonialism has never reached the same heights again. Thank you very much.
The Batumbele, do we have a Batumbele Sports Cup for one of our sports teams at Sol Plaatje University? And is that a possibility?
Now, very good question. Why I'm laughing, after those of you, I don't know whether our colleagues from UWC and from the other universities have seen the South Campus and the sports complex and so on. I actually put forward a request to the naming committee of the university that one of the sporting facilities be named after him. I was thinking of the main pavilion, and our director of institutional advancement said to me he needs more information about this person first. And Kondakele, our director, is also from the Eastern Cape. So I actually asked him to be here this afternoon, but I have put in a request that something be named after Isaiah Batumbele.
Just another question. I presume he was in the siege of Kimberley, and you mentioned that there's a collection of his that you're trying to access. Please tell me he wrote a diary about the siege of Kimberley like his brother-in-law did about Mafeking.
Unfortunately not. Well, not that we know of. He wrote one book, and that's why I regarded him as an author, but unfortunately nothing on the siege of Kimberley. What we've received so far is very quiet, actually, about the wartime.
Where is the Rhodes Cup and the Benato Cup today?
Luckily, they are being hosted and protected by sports museums. So at least it's in safekeeping.
And so maybe just on a separate note, and it's maybe not directly linked, but it's always a fascinating phenomena, this kind of resistance and sport, and how sport has always had this kind of, always been one of the many platforms that are used as vehicles for resistance. But likewise, also who you support. it was also kind of a step of resistance, and now I'm going to All Blacks versus, the Springboks. And so, so personally, I support, I support the All Blacks, but I also support the Springboks. I support the All Blacks because I think they are the best team, and I support I support the All Blacks because I really think they are an amazing team. But I also support South African rugby, and I support the Bokke because I'm a proud South African, and I believe that that's important in terms of identity. But it's always a conundrum, because whenever the All Blacks plays, I wear my All Blacks t-shirt proudly. When South Africa plays, I wear it proudly. And when they too play, I also have a t-shirt that's,
Yeah.
And so people always say, I'm confused. And I always kind of make the linkages between this confusion and colored people or brown people, how they support, specifically in South Africa. Even here in this very town, there's a massive All Black support base here in this very town. And so I just wanted to find out, so do you maybe have any thoughts on that in terms of who we support? What can we read into that? And if you maybe reflect on your own work, what are the implications of that, and how can we how can we theorize that? And how do we theorize this slightly differently? Because a lot of the kind of anecdotal information that I get from older, colored people is that they do not support, South African rugby, the Springboks in particular, because of the segregation. And so, but what you are revealing to us is, this is very temporal. It happened at a certain time when segregation became, kind of the order of the day. So, I would imagine that many people would be enlightened and would be actually pleasantly surprised to know that this wasn't always the case. When you mentioned a gentleman from the Western Cape, I forgot the name now, who was formed part of the tour in the
Pinky Hendricks.
Pinky
Julius, sorry.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about that because I don't think a lot of people know, have that knowledge. So, yeah, thanks so much.
You will be amazed about the current debate going on amongst sports historians. There's the Cape Crusaders, which I'm sure you know about, but I've got friends. There's one he's currently teaching in America, but he's from New Zealand. Other one is New Zealand. Both of them are professors in sport, and John Norright has written, and Doug Booth, a lot of South African sport and the history of South African sport. And even they have tried to get to the depth of this. And then you bring in Mark Fredericks, who's actually from Kimberley, but he's at Walter Sisulu University. Mark gets very upset on this topic. But it's fascinating, the debate that's going on. And it's I don't think it's something that's going to be resolved or dissolved within the next generation or two. It's become a cultural thing. There's no more political real linkage to it. It's a cultural thing. I support the All Blacks because they're playing a great kind of rugby. And especially now with the kind of rugby our national team is playing in comparison with them, it's something that's being debated, not in South Africa sports history circles alone, but all over the world. Wherever you come, people say to you, like you asked me now, what is your stance on this? And from a history point of view, I'm at ease with people doing that. I fully understand why it is happening, and some days I think it's maybe a better solution supporting the one and not the other one, because the other one is playing terrible rugby. But it's a massive debate that's going on, and nobody has really gotten. Throw in Hendrik Snyders into the pot as well, and you will find people trying to get to the bottom to this. But it's no longer a political thing. It's a cultural thing, and it cuts across different racial groupings as well. So it's something I think that's going to be with us for our lifetime. And I must say at this stage, it's something I'm very easy with. I don't get involved in the debate because I've made peace with it. I'm happy with the way people see it, and it's definitely not political.
Good afternoon. I must say that I'm quite nervous. I would like to first of all thank Dr. Lorato for putting me up here to present on our NPO. So now, for my presentation, I termed it Platfontein, a box. So now, okay, I wanted to speak a little bit about what I mean when I'm saying it's a box. So I'll start off by sharing a backstory about myself. It is the year 2009. I'm quite old. So I finished matric. I think somewhere in the beginning of the year, I had an opportunity to apply for a bursary to the Department of Health. So then I got approved for the bursary, but then I didn't have a place because I was not aware that higher institutions, you need to apply to higher institutions, and my parents were also not aware. So we are in this box where information is not coming through. So information is not flowing through. So here I am, I'm finished with school, I need to go somewhere to go and study. I have a bursary, but I don't have place. And then, luckily for me, the Department of Health went into great lengths trying to get me into certain institutions. We first went to using my parents, in actual fact, they didn't have anything on them. They had to go and borrow like a few hundred rands and hire someone's hire transport to take me to Bloemfontein. We went to UOs, we went to CUT, all of the universities, but they said, no, you don't have maths, you don't have science. And then they had to call in CPUT in Cape Town, Cape Peninsula University of Technology, and try to negotiate with the dean to allow me space into whatever program they might like, whatever program they found that year, which was dental assisting. So coming out of this box, I went to Bloemfontein first, biggest city from where I'm coming from. From there, I was transported to Cape Town. Now I found myself in Cape Town from a very, very rural community. I grew up in a makeshift tent with no electricity, no running water in the house. We cooked with fire. Now in my entire life, for the first time, at 18 years old, I found myself in a big city. I had to navigate my way around this city now. But then luckily enough, they managed to convince the dean. So they watched me closely during that program. That's the first time when I actually learned what a dental floss is. That is supposed to be common knowledge because oral hygiene is part of your life throughout. So now that's effects of being in a box. So this is the box most of my peers and the youth and the community is still entrapped in. So this box is still there. So, I had to navigate clogged a drain with pap because I never had like a drain in a house and I didn't know how to use it. Quite embarrassing, right? And then I jumped over a moving train when I thought it was going into the wrong direction, but I survived. I got onto a train from Cape Town Station that was meant to be parked. Luckily, I was in the train alone, but luckily I had someone who helped me out until I got to where I was going. But these are the struggles you are faced with if you exist in a box your entire life and you've been never exposed to the realities and the world outside. So, but I would say that this box is filled with untapped potential and talents, dreams that are yearning for liberation. But then this liberation, for the longest time we thought it's coming, but it's not forthcoming. So obviously we will have to do something about that. So now I said it's a box So as you can see on the slide, if you were to go now, even now, not to Cape Town, to Platfontein, the first thing you will notice is the houses with the broken windows, and you'll find a house that is smoking because there's a fire inside, and Oma making food, and she made fire in the house. And then you'd hear one day one politician saying that, no, we're not going to build RDP houses for Platfontein people because they don't appreciate and they don't look after these houses. Now my question is, an Oma, let's look at like an Oma, okay? So for her entire life, our people were relocated with the military, the defense force in the early 90s. And back in Namibia, the Oma lived in a hut, and this is her way of preparing food for the family. And now she's been living in a makeshift tent provided by the military, so that cycle continues. So she was cooking, this is how she prepared food. Now you're moving her into the house, and she doesn't have the resources to buy that hot plate, and she doesn't even have the knowledge to operate that. So now, would she rather starve than follow habit and survive? I will not touch on the broken windows, that's a story for another day. So I've included a few photos just to guide me through the presentation. I'm not familiar with these type of things, but yeah, let's see how it's gonna go. So now the population is about 7,000 plus. That was in the year 2011. I'm not sure if the relevant stats are out yet, but I'm sure we are way past that number. So now the community is Kung and Kwe, and majority of the population are youth and children in the community. So the spoken languages are Kung, Tali, and then Kwedam. So I have a sister here from Platfontein. She speaks Kung Tali, I'm speaking Kwedam. So that's the community of Platfontein. Okay, I said I labeled this pictures of hope. So now, is it left or which side is that? The one in the black and white? Okay, so these pictures are similar, but the one on this side, they call themselves the the Tombo tigers or the pineapple tigers. Now Tombo is a traditional beer. Yeah. So now one of the ingredients into that Tombo is called pineapple. So now, because that's the activity they are doing because of opportunities that are not forthcoming. So, but they are readily available to a challenge. So they went and played against the other team without even having practiced. So these are my pictures of hope. It's two pictures. The similarity that you will find here is that mostly their fate is the same. Whether you are drinking Tombo the whole day, every day, or whether you're staying at home, you are going nowhere. So that's the similarity. So now that has been happening in the community since it has been about 17 years in Platfontein. So now we have a school, we have matriculants, and they've been baking in the sun. As you can see, they are sun-baked. So they've been baking in the sun since, like, some of them left school, most of them, not most of them, but some of them dropped out of school. The fate is the same. We are going nowhere. We exist in this box, and that is our fate. Okay, I don't know why it's not moving. Right. At the Sun Vision Foundation, the vision that I had, because I had to experience life and had to navigate without, support and without guidance and all of these things. So the vision I had is to stand in that gap, in that gap that creates a divide. Because as it stands now, certain things might come across as common, normal, common, what is the word I'm looking for? Yeah, as common knowledge, or certain things are just common, but then with us, it's not the same. And that's where the divide exists. So our schooling starts when your parents takes you one day to school and they drop you off. Basically, we didn't have early childhood development, so they take you to school and they leave you at school. So now, once you are at school, you're on your own. Because what can I do for you? I'll tell you go to school, and I'll tell you tomorrow go to school, and I'll tell you go to school. Years ago, when we were still in Smithrift, they would tell us, go and drink soup at the school. So that was the backing, why you have to go to school. We are hungry at home, go and drink soup. But now they're saying, go to school and get an education. What is this education? That they can't give us. Because when we are left, I'm living here speaking my mother language. And then I get there, I find unfamiliar faces. I find an unfamiliar language. I'll have to adapt, adjust. I don't know how we do it, but I think it's certain codes. So yeah, then you start learning, which is Afrikaans. And then during that process, if you didn't catch on fast enough and you are left behind while other children comprehended and they learned and they understood, you are on your own. Your parents don't know where to take you. Even if you had learning disabilities, how? Even if you had like a smallest challenge as eyes, like you don't have like proper eyesight, you're on your own. So if you can't, you may read, but if you can't understand what you're reading, it's a problem you have to navigate through. So these are the things that divide us from the broader society, because we don't have that support. If you're at school, you have to find your way to understand and get on. Homework, what is homework? because we never, my parents couldn't understand, and but not for me, but yeah. Luckily, my dad had some, and he was very passionate about education, and he would have me recite even if it was not pronouncing certain words correctly, he used to have me recite these things at night until I fall asleep, and then he loves doing soma, what is it? Maths? So he would, give me, and then people would pass. It's like, hey, it's always cool here at your house. So now, so these are the challenges that we are faced with when we get to school. So now you don't have support. You can't bring your homework to school because there's no one to help you. So now all the other elements of education, you don't get to experience it. So you go through, and then even as you approach the end of it, you get so demotivated and everything, because now you can see, okay, now I understand, but this understanding is limited within that contains of this box. Now I see that, okay, but this guy finished school, all of them did, what's happening? So now our celebrations are based on my child passed matric, yay. Okay, what now? And even with that, the quality of results are declining and it's very poor. So now where do you go with poor marks? Because obviously the universities don't want you to come and take up space that a deserving student had. And also the fact that you also now you have a connotation and label as someone coming from platform. They no, you don't complete things, you run away. But then, that's where I think I need to also emphasize. All right, you are saying students or learners from Platfontein are not completing studies and whatnot, and they tend to leave in the middle of, like a lot of them started the college or wherever and then they dropped out. So now, did you ever try to find out why that happens? Did you ever try to find out, or did you try to like go add, like it's not, I'm not trying to sound entitled, but just a reason behind why. Because our schooling system is, when I was doing that course, I did not know how to even do like a simple research to write an assignment. Because when you are doing an obstial, you script net your, but okay, yeah, from your imagination. So you're telling a story. So you didn't go, because we didn't have resources, we didn't have libraries, you can't go, and the teachers didn't even try to as much guide you into that direction, saying, okay, here's a library, go and explore, this is the topic, this is what you need to do to come up with the story that you need to tell. But then all the stories that we did in those essays were things that we came up with, and some are even asking their elder brother and sisters to write these essays for them. So if I don't know how to do research, if I don't understand what is required for me to succeed when I come to like an institution that like this, I am like deemed to fail. So I'd rather spare myself that embarrassment and excuse myself because I'm struggling. And not that alone, I'm struggling, but I was also not taught how to ask for help, and I don't know what help to ask for. So how do I help myself in this situation? So that's what we are sitting with in Platfontein, the school, and our learners and our youth. So now we also find, because of the challenge I mentioned, you start school, you find a different language. So now certain learners fall behind. You don't like read. Like I was shocked in my class in grade 9 when they tried, because there's a thing where certain learners are sitting in class silently. You haven't said a word of Afrikaans, but your teacher somehow progressed you until you are in grade 9. They haven't given you a chance to read out loud, to even see if you are understanding what you've been given, because you've been copying from the board. Yeah. So I was shocked in grade 9 when it was natural, what is natuurwetenskappe, natural science. No. Yes. We had to read, and because of the background of the community, we had like students in the class, learners in the class who were way above, schooling age. But what shocked me the most is most of learners in the class couldn't read past 3 maybe words or so. And I was like, how is it possible that you can't read? Because you need to understand to progress. So this is why reading is important, and this is one of our initiatives. We want to help, but now we can't, because they are far into whatever they are doing, and they're in high school already. So now we start with the children. So we help those who have low proficiency reading to read, and not just to read, but to understand what they are reading. So these are the things that I'm interested in, and these are the things that the organization wants to do. And also afternoon support, where we bring together like high school, but then the NPOs is still like new. So when we started, then COVID hit, so we had to like suspend. And when you propose an idea like this to other funders don't think, why is it necessary? Because this is generic and this is a common problem across, and we are interested in funding sciences and maths and STEM and whatever. So now you are excluded further. So these are the things we are interested in also to guide. So now this is our logo. So I think it's self-explanatory. This is like you can see the sun figurine and then the bow and the weapon. Okay, those years, these were the weapon. So now the book represents a new form of art of weapon we want to use to develop the community. So now there's a search icon and the atlas inside, which means that we can integrate into the world using education as a tool, which means that then a new dawn or a sunrise will exist in the community. So that's about the logo of the Sand Vision Foundation. In terms of representation, we spoke about, I don't know who spoke about it, but then I think Dr. Lorato was presenting somewhere when UNESCO declared the 10 years of indigenous but when these things are done, like the government, I don't know, we tend to be used as smoke screens for I don't know what is there. Just to as a smoke screen to their funders to see that we are interested, we take note. And then, okay, we are sitting here in Platfontein, and then we are not like equally represented there. So we are usually used as smoke screen, and we need representation, especially here in the Northern Cape. So when policy issues that relates to policies and all of these things are discussed, there's no representation, because none of our people are there. Even if they were to select someone, they would probably find someone who would not even really, who doesn't even really have like a knowledge to understand certain issues. So I think these are the things, challenges that we have. And information sharing, as I was speaking, I think we, as the youth, I will be one of them. I will invest my time into getting information across, especially amongst youth, women, so that we do understand how certain things work, and we do fully understand before we take part and participate, and we do understand what is required, and we do understand. I'm speaking for the community, the Kung and Kwe community in Platfontein, for our other San communities, Kwe and San communities in Namibia. They are far advanced because their system of education and their government prioritized maybe in developing and growing, and they were interested in the affairs of but now it seems as if we are boxed and excluded. So now the system, I included the system as well. So I'm saying the system does not provide us that platform to thrive. To thrive. I don't know how to, but I don't know how to explain that one. But I would say it doesn't allow us to thrive, because when we look at the unemployment rate and all of these things, although less than 1% of the employable, not just the employable youth have some sort of qualification, there are certain career opportunities that require only grade 12 and to mention the police, the correctional services, and the military, that requires grade 12 for intake, and then we'd go and apply, but then we are overlooked. So the system is further, is it oppressing or what is the word? Yeah, so now, and then education. So now, because there's this declaration that looks into promoting indigenous languages over 10 years, I think if there are institutions that can maybe collaborate and work with and identify a few youth, I think Professor Chabane spoke about, he's a linguist. I was so inspired by his presentation here, and because our identity is necessary for us to understand who we are, we can train, because it's about language and promotion of indigenous languages, maybe we can train a few and have that extra nudge, not just train as if I'm coming from a house where my parents fully understood what I need to do when I get to university, but to also prepare, give enough time for me to prepare and then get into the studies and give additional support also to get through, like mentorship and all of these things. So yeah, these are the challenges I have noted, and I think it is necessary and it's urgent because wow. Yeah. So, but it's not a sad story. It's a story that inspires hope and light and a growth of a community that has been cocooned. It's the time to come out and, you know, yeah. So, yeah, I'm taking your time. We're good now.
Anmiray, thank you very much. For somebody that said she was nervous, you did great. Really, no, it was awesome. Thank you very much. You and I and Sukaina had this discussion yesterday over lunchtime because you had one of the young men from Platfontein in the same situation at Sol Plaatje University. So based partially on that, I'm very nervous to ask this question because I actually know what you expect, but you spoke about smoke screens and things like that. But for the Sun Vision Foundation, from the region and from the province, what positive or constructive support do you get, if any? Because I know, for example, tourism has made many promises and that's collapsed, arts and culture. So is there a positive story to it as well when it comes to support to your foundation?
I wouldn't say there is right now, but we will continue to knock on several doors. Because when we had this sporting initiative, we did it without funding. So even the trophy and then the soccer kit, I had to raise, I had to use my own money to as a prize, because I had went to sports, arts and culture, and they said, no, you need to be registered. There's a process. So then if you are in the, if you have followed that, then only do they support you too. So, yeah.
Please let's talk offline then afterwards. Thanks.
You have Trevor?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, I also just wanted to echo that. Amazing work that you are doing. And I think it needs to be acknowledged. It's clearly that a lot of selflessness that is going into this, because you mentioned having to sacrifice and having to give your own resources, and I'm sure that is not endless. So whatever you're giving into the community, it really takes from yourself. So I just wanted to acknowledge and commend you for that, and we will also definitely, speak afterwards, because I do think we need to come to the party, and so yeah, I hope this is definitely a first step, in that. And again, just buy a donkey, what's like here.
Most of the time it will be someone telling your story, but
now that you are directly involved, directly initiating things that could take you out of the box is very, very interesting. But when I listen to this, the effect of relocation and then isolation into the present place, you can imagine the traumas for your parents. They were taken from the environment they knew so well, that helped them express a certain culture within what they related most in terms of land resources and all. And then you come now to another place that has no similar geography, no similar experiences that you can tell. And we are now aping an existence that is really difficult. I'm also looking at the time and say, in terms of certain experiences of really getting used to the environment, it's short. You needed a relocation and then into a certain community of that place to make sense of how that environment could benefit you. So this isolation where you are is also a problem, and I'm quite certain that it will take a long time for the youth to appreciate that where they come from and where they should go to will really need a lot of selflessness. So you are an example to the youth and an example to the community. And I think what needs to happen now is that all the programs of development from the state, from the province, should really appreciate the struggles we are in. First, the linguistic problem, the struggles, the cultural struggles within the province. And when I hear you saying you are trying the literacy classes, I'm saying, literacy does also well when it is associated with certain cultural experiences. So for a relocated community, such experiences are not so are not tangible. So it means a lot of struggle, and you may also wish to have some contact with where the communities were relocated from and see what has happened since the relocation there. So that could also help to give a certain dimension of belonging, that where you are coming from is not like nothing remained. There are still people, they still have a certain culture, they can still share with you those experiences, and then you will see how they are managing in terms of education, in terms of literacy efforts, and so forth and so on. So relocation was a tragedy, but now within this new dispensation, I'll then say, try to link up with the experiences in Namibia, the communities that remain there, and see how you could forge a way forward. But this is really one of the wonderful things that I'm hearing. It's a personal testimony that also speaks to the experiences of a community. So thank you very much for this. I hope we shall have an opportunities to talk and then see how we could also link with our Botswana, Kwedam communities and Krum communities in northern Botswana. Thank you.
January, die versoek trots wat jy vir die gemeenskap doen. Ek het professor Shabani het gister my 'n vraag gevra. Die vraag wat hy vir my gevra het, Piet, hoeveel mense is nog daar wat soos jy is, dat namens julle mense praat? Hoeveel mense is daar van julle inheemse mense wat uitkom, wat die geskiedenis het, wat leef maar hy volle hopbare kennis om te praat soos ons nou so praat, dat hy voorrecht het om te kan praat by universiteit of by ander vlakte. Ek het vir 1 jaar en 8 maande gebly in Bloemfontein. Ek het saam met Chief Kakenke, Sabao, Maungo, Kabembe, ek het met die mense saamgewerk in klas stende. So ek het baie geleer en ek ken die pyn en ek ken die hartseer van Bloemfontein. Daarom is ek trots dat jy daar staan om namens die mense te praat, om uit te kom, om die storie en die verhale, wel, dat is seerpijne, wel, dat is hartseer. Ons moet nie dit opkyk nie, ons moet 'n verskil maak om ons pyn uit te dra en uit te bring, sodat, as ek so die kindertjies opkyk, dan dink ek, dis ons toekoms van môre, die generasie, wat ons moet, ons sterf met kennis, dan moet ons oorbring. Baie dankie, Anmiray, dat jy kon praat en laat die boodskap uitgaan.
I am really impressed, with your presentation, and as I'm sitting here, I can actually relate, and because it's a painful experience. And sometimes whenever I talk to people around, they just see the professor, but they don't know what's behind the professor. So I was under a Christian scholarship, and when you started, when you actually talked about the challenges in Cape Town, I could relate to them, because for me, I had to travel from Namibia. Now the first thing was, as a village boy, they asked me, do I have a passport? And then I said, yes, I've got a passport, because by then we had the clinic passports,
Oh my word!
And everything was okay. And so the day that I was supposed to travel now, it was just few days, and then they asked me, no, we need to put the study permit and apply for the study permit, so where's the passport? And then I went with the clinic passport. Yes, and they had to actually engage the ministry and a number of people up there to assist me. And then from there, I actually traveled with the bus. I was in Cape Town. A number of things happened. The first thing, the very same train that you are talking about, I know of a train that has got a locomotive, and then, there are wagons. This one doesn't have a head, I'm not saying it, it goes both ways. So, yeah, and amongst other things, I also, the background again, when you talk of the houses, the dwellings, how it is actually, where you need to make fire inside and so on. And then I got a bursary allowance of 800 rands, and then I had to eat at the dining room at the hostels now. What I have decided, I actually went back to my sponsors. I told them, I don't want to eat at the dining hall, because I need to send money home for my mom. So that 1,000 that I'm using per month, I want to send home. So initially it was a challenge, but then later on I convinced them, and then I was getting a check. So I would cash it, send to my mom, and then the 800 I would remain with. So sometimes people don't understand, what we are going through. And I'm really happy that you guys as youth are involved in sports, for example. I'm also part of sport. Earlier when Dr. Lorato was talking about football and I'm a football team owner, I was like, oh my God, I hope it's not me. And when she continued with cricket, I was like, okay, now at least I'm open, because I never had such a discussion with her, because as much as I'm part of sport, when you said you actually had to buy, a football kit and everything there, I was like, oh my God, I'm also involved in this, so we need to collaborate to see, what we can do. In terms of, I could actually sponsor the next kit, maybe if you have a tournament again, we will see. Because I part and parcel of that. And I mean, don't underestimate the power of sport. Earlier we had a presentation, and this actually comes from the 1800s, for example. It was clear that sports can change a number of things. So capitalize on that. And then, as Prof Shebana rightfully mentioned, don't forget about the groups in Namibia as well, Namibia and Botswana. So if you can collaborate, I mean, you need to look into that as well. And talking about the Namibian situation, about the Sun groups, at least, I mean, the Prime Minister's office is actually, I mean, there's dedicated effort whereby they are doing everything to assist the Sun communities. The only thing, in some instances, is, and I'm really happy that from your side and also from Uncle Pete here, we have had discussions whereby people, when they see us, they feel sorry for us. You know, I mean, we are faced with that. You know, you don't even ask for bread, but then people are like, you are a Khoi or a San, I mean, you need, I mean, you know, so we need to do away with these kind of things. And I'm really happy that people are actually standing up from their communities to actually fight these battles themselves. So that's the most important thing. We need to fight these battles, I mean, by our own, you know. We need assistance. When we need assistance, we will go there and ask, but then, please leave me, let me fight, and then you just assist me. So, I mean, that should be the route that we need to take. So, thank you very much.
Just to say huge congratulations on what you're doing, and thanks for communicating about it. I know something of what you mean when you refer to smoke screen. I've seen quite often government will get a dance group at a function to demonstrate diversity, and that's where it ends. So it's great to see all that you're doing, and I think it's going to be good to interact. I'm pleased to hear that you're already in discussion with the museum to see what we can do, but I appreciate the comments that communities need to do their thing. And so congratulations and thank you very much.
You know, like you said, that the government and they use communities as smoke screens. But I think that there are things that a much bigger issue by using communities as smoke screens that you depoliticize their issues. If they are not represented, if it's not them to speak about their issues do not become as political as they are. Like the fact that you are here, you're speaking about, I mean, you have what I would call an ontological access to the experiences of your community, and no one can represent those experiences better than the people who go through, those experiences. And like when you spoke about inclusivity, and representation, that's exactly what came to mind to me, is that if you don't include, marginalized communities, you are depoliticizing their issues and their struggles. The second thing that I want to talk about is, I'm skeptical to say success, but I'll use the word relatively. It has a tendency of dispossessing us. We become more successful than our counterparts. We leave the communities, and then we leave them with any positive image, outlook. All they see is each other. So what you're doing with this project is actually tackling that that tendency of being dispossessed from your community and leaving them with nothing to look at or an exit. So, yeah, you're doing a great job. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. So the poem that I'm about to perform, it's titled V.S. Ek. And this poem came about when I was in search of my identity. Who am I as an individual? Who am I, as a citizen of this world? And sorry, just bear with me. So in search of that, it produced the following poem, like I said, V.S. Egg. And for now, I would just like you to sit back, relax, open up yourself, and just receive. Wie is ek? Wie is ek is die vraag wat my beet het, warm het onder die kraag, dag na dag. Kleerling, is dit wie ek is? 'n forced identity. Dit is wat hy sê, jy sê, wat ek sê, ek is kooi. Wat as ek sê ek is kooi, wat is my tradisies? Waar is die askoek, roosterkoeke om die vuur? Vuur. Wie van julle maak nog vuur, bloed vir die rede om die families en hul geskille in die regte rigtings in te stuur? Of het die vuurmaakseremonie net weer 'n tyd geraak waar ons onsself verloor en ander verwyd? Tradisies. Wat is, was ons tradisies? So baie het gekom om ons te ontleed. Hulle sê ons is nie 'n nasie, want ons het nie 'n P-bladlyn nie. Van bloedlyne, die weet ek niks. Maar daar wat hy nie loopie, daar kruip hy. Kind, wie is jy? Wie is jy? Dit is 'n smeltkroes van die wêreld se DNA binne jou in saamgeweef. Wie is jy? Wie is jy? Thank you. So on this quest, I've also discovered the road to uncovering. The uncovering of my emotions and perspective on life. The uncovering of my racial classification as a colored, an identity given to me. And with this colored identity, a definition of what a colored ought to be. I've come to the conclusion that with all of life's isms and the systems that I've been subjected to, that I have felt classified, lesser than human. With my poetry, I claim my identity as Khoi, yes. Not to be placed yet in another racial box, but rather claiming my birthright as human, and to be treated as such. I am merely a vessel. As my poems, they ask me to write them. But what's very interesting is the fact that Anmiray, I would start to write a poem with no idea of what is going to come out. And then it simply just produces itself. And whenever this happens, I believe that something else is taking over. And I call the character that takes over Anna Moervreter van sy's gatvol. And speaking of Anna Moervreter, this is one of Anna Moervreter's poems, Rakwys. Kite says, Tavidus, ek groet jou in die naam om die hede te verstaan, julle te vermaan, moet ons teruggaan in tyd. So moet jy vir my kostate vertel dat ons moet die verlede laat gaan. Want kyk, ons beendere sal praat vanuit die verlede tot in die hede. Ons mense was geryp, deur hulle laat versuip. Wat die is ons kans en ek sal dit met albei hande aangryp. Ons jaggie vir ons bome en pyp, want julle weet mos ons vision lê wyd. Want waar jy gesien dat konings moet kruip. Ons is die First Nation van die land, ons spore is die frekkie wat het diep getrap in die Kalahari se sand. Mense met knowledge, onderdruk, verdruk, dat hulle nou nog aan ons idees kom staan te verryk. Namaqualand jy wou ons uitwis. Die koei as die frekkie, ons is nog steeds hier, ons beweeg hier. Sit ou boet, sit dan kyk vir ons goed. Want ons kon nie baklei met die guns en goed, wat met die waarheidsmerk om ons die leuns uitwoed. Ons gaan inklim in jou brein. Nie op jou shallow mindset te teer, wat om shifts te maak op die planeet wat jy lewe. A unit is een, a phase is a real. Wat saam maak ons die universe. Julle bou voort in reverse. So I was asked what inspires my poetry, and the themes, where do I get my themes from? So the preservation of the essence of humanity, that is exactly what inspires me to write. Through my poetry, I believe that I have the ability to invite my audience to view things from a perspective that's different to that of their own. My poetry allows my audience to understand the reality of another in a manner that the person, I'm inviting you to come and sit next to me. This is what I see. This is my experience. I'm not forcing it down your throat. All I'm asking for you is come and take a seat next to me. So M.O.R.E also wrote the following, Hail Somebody Wind. And that's what I'm going to share with you now. Hail somebody wind, want wreed is die kind ontneem van haar taal identiteit. Hail somebody wind. Hail somebody wind, want die hemelse trane is droog gehuil. Hail somebody wind. Wat nou wil julle agter veediefstal en droogtes kom skuil. Hail somebody wind. Want met elke bloeddruppel wat geval het op hierdie grond is hierdie aarde mee vervloek. So huil somebody wind. Die vloeke van jou voorouers sal julle volg totdat die kind terugkry wat aan hulle behoort. Hail somebody wind. Now, some of my poems, they derive from a place where I was hurt. I'm not alone, and that I know. I speak for many. In other cases, my poems will take on the themes of current happenings in the world as they are unfolding to me, as we are interconnected, and therefore we are affected by what's happening around us. And this is my poem. In closing, Munchies praat. Who doesn't know what the meaning of munchies is? Who doesn't know? Mula? I say. So munchies praat, ne? Money. Fok jou feelings, week sal jy moet week. Hoe gaan jy vir jou family provide? Nee, jy moet kos op die tafel sit. Wat kyk jy worry? Honger vir kos as ek mos lankal nie. Ek smaak ook financial freedom proe. Nou kyk jy, ek wil financial freedom proe gespuis met confidence en waardigheid. Want ek kan ook lekker hoog met my kop in die lug loop. So moenie van my kos sê, my hemel is iewers daarbo. Terwyl julle die hemelvrugte hier op aarde proe. Nou kyk jy, ek smaak financial freedom proe. Lankal is ek nie meer honger vir kos. Ek smaak financial freedom proe. Want ek smaak ook 'n paar brand new tikkies vir my koek, sonder om heelman deur my ribbes te kakafo. Lankal is ek nie meer honger vir kos.